Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья! Hi everyone! Fyodor Dostoevsky was 25 when he published his first novel, Poor Folk, in 1846. 3 years later, he was sentenced to death in 1849 when he was only 28 years old. A last-minute reprieve from the Tsar himself saved his life, but he spent almost 10 years in Siberia, most of it doing hard labor. He published Crime and Punishment in 1866 when he was 45. Terrible gambling problem followed. In 1879, he published his masterpiece, Brothers Karamazov, and he died soon after in 1881 at the age of 59. He suffered from epilepsy throughout his life. He wrote 12 novels, 4 novellas, and 16 short stories. Now, Dostoevsky is considered the greatest Russian writer along with Tolstoy, Chekhov, and Turgenev. But none of them experienced life from the lowest to the highest. His novel, Notes from Underground, is considered the first existentialist novel that influenced future writers such as Albert Camus, Franz Kafka, and even the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. In addition to being one of the greatest novelists ever, he's also studied as one of the greatest philosophers of the 19th century. His novels are centered on deeper philosophical psychological topics. If Tolstoy was a historian and sociologist, Dostoevsky was a psychologist or archaeologist of human existentialist suffering, and had a huge influence on the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Albert Einstein said Dostoevsky gives him more than any scientist. Dostoevsky is, I think, a father figure to millions of readers around the world. In an era of nihilism, most young men have lost their sense of purpose, and there's a sense of fatherlessness too that permeates the modern society. The old father-son connection has been lost in many parts of the world due to rapid modernization. I think understanding his work can give people, especially young men, a new perspective on life. So in this video, I'll discuss all his major novels, including Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, Notes from Underground, The Idiot, Demons, as well as 2 of his most profound short stories, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man and White Nights. But first, let me compare Dostoevsky to another Russian giant, Leo Tolstoy, which should give you a good background understanding of Dostoevsky in the Russian context. At the end, I'll also compare Dostoevsky to the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, another thinker who fought nihilism. By the way, if you want to buy the script of this video in a book format, you can find the link down below. This also supports the channel, so thank you very much. Here's a fact. Dostoevsky and Tolstoy lived around the same time, often in the same city, St. Petersburg, but they never met. Dostoevsky was eager to meet, but Tolstoy apparently showed no interest. It's pure speculation, but I think Tolstoy, being a count, saw Dostoevsky just as a regular dude. Both authors, however, were friends with Turgenev. Also, another reason is that Tolstoy disliked Dostoevsky's most famous novel, Crime and Punishment, because he wasn't convinced that a poor young man would be willing to murder people to get rich or change the world. Dostoevsky, however, was full of admiration for Tolstoy's great novel, Anna Karenina. Here is Dostoevsky. Anna Karenina is sheer perfection as work of art. No European work of fiction of our present day comes anywhere near it. Furthermore, the idea underlying it shows that it is ours, something that belongs to us alone, and that's our property, our own national new word, or at any rate, the beginning of it. After Dostoevsky's death in 1881, Tolstoy lamented, "I have never seen this man and never had any relations with him, and all of a sudden when he died I understood that this was the closest, the dearest man for me, the man whose presence I needed the most. I considered him a friend and had no doubt that we will see each other someday." But unfortunately they never did. In this video I'll compare the 2 giants of Russian literature, Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky. I'll tell you about their lives, novels, styles of writing, themes, characters, belief, and much more. At the end, I'll tell you which author is more popular today. I'll show you some stats as well and tell you which author I prefer and why. I have summarized and reviewed 3 of Dostoevsky's novels, Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, and Notes from Underground, and 2 of Tolstoy's novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Also, in separate videos, I have talked about 8 lessons from Tolstoy and 8 lessons from Dostoevsky, mainly about their life philosophies. I'll put a link in the description in case you want to watch them later. Russian context. In the 18th century, under Catherine the Great, Russia expanded east to Siberia and south to Central Asia, adopted French language and culture. Then Napoleon got excited thinking Russians would welcome him, but he got humiliated in 1812. Both Dostoevsky and Tolstoy grew up reading the 2 great Russian romantic poets, Alexander Pushkin and Mikhail Lermontov, but also the satirical prose of Nikolai Gogol. They both witnessed one of the most important events in Russian history, taking place in 1861, when 31 million Russian serfs were emancipated. At the same time, there was a huge influx of Western influence like French art and literature, German and English capitalism, as well as philosophies of utilitarianism, rationalism, and atheism. Russian intellectuals were divided between the Slavophiles, who wanted to keep Russian values and traditions on the one hand, and Westernized radicals who wanted to destroy the Russian way of life in order to build a modern, rational society on the other. This struggle culminated in 1917 Communist Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin. Life and career. Dostoevsky was born in 1821 in Moscow. Unlike other writers of his period, he was a city boy, not a country gentleman. His father was a low-level doctor. Tolstoy was born 7 years later in 1828 in their family country state Yasnaya Polyana and grew up in an aristocratic family. So their wildly different socioeconomic situation influenced their worldview and writings. Dostoevsky's first novel, Poor Folk, about the plight of the Russian poor, published in 1845 when he was 24 years old. Dostoevsky's entire body of work focuses on those at the bottom of the Russian society. Tolstoy's first novel, Childhood, published 6 years later in 1852 when he was 23 years old, focused on his own life growing up, in which he wrote about losing both parents at a very young age. Tolstoy's mother died when he was 2 and his father died when he was 9. As a result of growing up without parents, Tolstoy's entire body of work focuses on family. Tolstoy published 2 more novels in the series, titled Boyhood and Youth, all autobiographical. Dostoevsky, however, had a very different fate after his first novel. In 1849, he was arrested, almost executed because of his radical activities, and sent to Siberia, where he spent almost 10 years in the harshest conditions. The result was a massive change in his views about Russia and the West. He depicted that experience in Siberia in his novel The House of the Dead in 1861. Tolstoy, however, had an easier time of it. He spent his time womanizing, drinking wine, and gambling like Prince Harry. He was expelled from Kazan University in Tatarstan, where he was supposed to study Oriental languages. To experience the harsh reality of life, Tolstoy joined the army in the Battle of Crimea in 1854 and 55. This experience helped him to grow up a bit, but also helped give his writing depth, especially later on in War and Peace. After returning from exile, Dostoevsky wrote like crazy. First, he published Notes from Underground in 1864, considered the first existentialist novel. That same year, he lost both his wife and brother. 2 years later, in 1866, he published his most famous novel, Crime and Punishment. Around the same time, Tolstoy got married to a very young woman, traveled to Europe, and wrote 3 novels: Family Happiness in 1859, The Cossacks in 1863, and his most famous novel, War and Peace, in 1869. Dostoevsky's last and longest novel, The Brothers Karamazov, which most people believe to be his greatest novel, was published in 1879, 2 years before his death in 1881. Tolstoy's own favorite novel, Anna Karenina, was published 2 years before The Brothers Karamazov in 1877. Tolstoy's last novel, Haji Murat, was published in 1912, 2 years after his own death in 1910. Dostoevsky wrote 16 novels and novellas, a career that lasted 36 years, with Brother Karamazov being the longest, with 350,000 words or about 1,000 pages in English translation. Crime and Punishment is about 210,000 words or 700 pages. Tolstoy wrote 14 novels and novellas, a career that lasted 42 years. Tolstoy's longest novel, War and Peace, is 587,000 words or 2,000 pages. His second longest novel is Anna Karenina with 350,000 words or 1,000 pages. Both were in Russian army for a period of time. Both traveled to Europe extensively. Dostoevsky was 59 when he died, while Tolstoy lived to be 82. It shows how tough a life Dostoevsky endured, mostly in the city, while Tolstoy lived a somewhat comfortable life in the countryside. This shows in their fiction too. Dostoevsky's novels are mostly about those at the bottom of the society, from his first novel, Poor Folk, to his last novel, The Brothers Karamazov. His characters grapple with poverty and money. While Tolstoy mostly wrote about those at the top, the nobility and the aristocrats. Of course, there are some exceptions. Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot is about an aristocrat, be it not a very rich man, whom everyone calls an idiot, while Tolstoy wrote novels about the poor as well. Tolstoy was a tall man at 5'11 or 181 centimeters, while Dostoevsky was 5'6 or 169 centimeters tall. Even the name Tolstoy in Russian means thick or fat, and his first name Leo or Lev means lion. Not sure if his name gave him much confidence or not. Fyodor means a man of God, and Dostoevsky comes from a place named in the village of Dostoyev in modern-day Belarus. I'm of the same height as Dostoevsky, so I can feel his pain as a short man. Speaking of pain, Dostoevsky also suffered from ill health, especially epilepsy, something he shares with so many famous novelists like Flaubert, Dickens, Poe, and Dante. Tolstoy, however, had no real health issues. He was a fitness fanatic, and that's why he lived to be 82 years old. Human suffering. Both authors wrote about suffering. Dostoevsky's suffering is partly economic and partly existential. His characters are mostly poor people who are desperate for a place in the world, seeking meaning and purpose. In other words, poverty on the outside and suffering on the inside. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is a poor student who commits a crime that torments him on the inside. In Notes from Underground, the narrator hides from society where he was humiliated. In Brothers Karamazov, all the brothers suffer because they feel lost between atheism, hedonism, and religion. For Dostoevsky, the cause of suffering is the breakdown of social fabrics, religious faith, and the arrival of Western individualism. As a result, Russians, seeking a quick fix, they adopted Western ideas like atheism, rationalism, and utilitarianism. Dostoevsky acknowledges rationality being helpful in alleviating illnesses and helping the economy, but not only it was an inadequate solution to your existential crisis, it was also dangerous as it broke the old social fabrics to let individuals loose to commit terrible crimes, as in Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. Without the fear of God, anything was permissible. So for the most part, Dostoevsky blamed modernity for the moral and existential crisis of his fellow Russians, which resulted in their suffering. Tolstoy's suffering is usually because of one's failure to fulfill their duty to their family or society. In other words, Tolstoy's suffering is caused by social institutions like nation and family. War and Peace centers on warfare among nations that caused immense suffering among both the French and the Russians. Anna Karenina is about the institution of family and social norms that cause suffering. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is about how selfishness can harm those around you. So Tolstoy's suffering is more about the failure of fulfilling your duties to your family and society. So, for Dostoevsky, it was the individual in crisis, thus he is called a psychologist, while for Tolstoy, it was society in crisis, thus considered a sociologist. Their solution to suffering also differs. Dostoevsky wanted to insulate Russia from the bad ideas coming, while Tolstoy looked to the whole humanity for an answer. Dostoevsky's answer to suffering is a kind of blind, naive love, which can be equated to religious faith, the value of simplicity and naivety that existed among the Russian peasants. This resonates with Dostoevsky's own life. His criminal conviction meant that he spent 10 years among the Russian peasants, but also affected his life and career, so he was seeking forgiveness and love no matter what mistakes you made in the past. Dostoevsky wanted to insulate Russia from the dangers of bad ideas coming into the country. His own criminal conviction was due to Western influence. A good example is in Notes from Underground. A man goes into himself while hiding underground. Even in Crime and Punishment, Siberia is a kind of isolated place where Raskolnikov's soul can be saved. Dostoevsky was a Slavophile, passionately supported the Russian peasants to the point that some criticized him for being anti-Semitic. Dostoevsky was anti-capitalist, so as it happened, a lot of the bankers and capitalists offering loans at the time were Jewish people, and most people in debt were the Russian peasants. So Dostoevsky conflated Jewish people with capitalism or westernization. Tolstoy, however, criticized the old institutions like family and church as being outdated and in need of modernization. He was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church for criticizing it. Tolstoy believed in the ideals of European Enlightenment and universalist humanism. He even corresponded with people all around the world. Tolstoy had a more optimistic view of humans, that through education, people can be molded and shaped into good beings and good citizens. So he founded several schools for the peasants and promoted pacifism around the world. Dostoevsky, on the other hand, was pessimistic about humans for being too irrational and flawed, therefore cannot be trusted if left to their own devices in the presence of bad ideas, the company of bad friends. Dostoevsky believed there is a kind of darkness inside of us, a demon, a destructive force that leads you to do terrible things due to greed and selfishness, even damage your own lives through addiction to sex, gambling, shopping, food, alcohol, or drugs. Tolstoy, however, like Rousseau, believed humans are in essence good, but it's the society that corrupts them. Writing style. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov are murder mysteries. Tolstoy wrote family drama. Tolstoy is a master of juxtaposing the warmth and the cold dynamics among people, in families, among soldiers, friends, and even strangers. In one moment, there is a genuine feeling of comfort being with others, then there are moments you can't stand others. Dostoevsky's strength is a dramatic storytelling, while Tolstoy's strength is vivid and poetic writing. Dostoevsky's writing is quite messy, dark, spontaneous, and improvised, almost explosive. Tolstoy's writing appears a little bit more methodical, calm, and measured. Dostoevsky's characters act on their own free will, so they make terrible mistakes, irrational decisions, and often self-destruct. But they are proactive and make things happen. Tolstoy's characters, however, are more bound by social norms, family, and society. Things happen to them. Tolstoy believed social changes or historical events were not the deeds of individuals, but the whole society. So someone like Napoleon didn't steer history, but he himself was bound by history and societal forces. Tolstoy's novels have no single, but many protagonists. Dostoevsky's characters are mentally shackled and tormented, while Tolstoy characters are socially stifled through marriage or social class. Dostoevsky's characters are victims of their own choices, while Tolstoy's characters are victims of social change and conventions. Dmitry Merezhovsky, a Russian novelist, said that Tolstoy wrote about external or earthly truths, i.e. societal truths, while Dostoevsky wrote about internal or divine truth, in other words, psychological truth. All of Dostoevsky's protagonists are men. Female characters tend to come to save the troubled men and restore their souls. In Crime and Punishment, Sonia the prostitute comes to rescue Raskolnikov. In Notes from the Underground, Lisa almost saves the underground man. In Brothers Karamazov, female characters restore men. Tolstoy, on the other hand, gave female characters more central roles in his novels. Anna and Anna Karenina, Natasha Rostova and War and Peace are the protagonists. Tolstoy was sympathetic towards women's freedom. High society, Tolstoy's main setting, limited individual freedom to guard societal norms and traditions, especially women. Dostoevsky, however, was more concerned with the Russian peasants, where there were not many educated women seeking freedom. Among the Russian peasants, women worked and suffered alongside men, so there was a kind of equality there. In Tolstoy's novels, human cruelty, or perhaps the ability to be cruel, is often hidden from view, so one has to peel back a layer to find it. While in Dostoevsky's novels, human cruelty is in the open. Tolstoy's upper-class characters are very good at hiding their true selves, as they are bound by many social conventions. while Dostoevsky's lower-class characters are more like open books. Even in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov didn't have to confess, but he did. Why? Again, that Russian honesty. Even Tolstoy agreed that the Russian peasants lived a more authentic and genuine life. In War and Peace, Pierre meets a peasant and he is spiritually liberated. In the death of Ivan Ilyich, Ivan learns wisdom from his servant Gerasim. Another interesting thing you notice in Dostoevsky's novel is how lonely his protagonists are. None of his male characters are close to their families, and some even hate their families as they tend to be dysfunctional. In Notes from Underground, the narrator is alone inside an underground basement and mentions no family, and his friends abandon him. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is very irritated when his mother and sister show up. In the Brothers Karamazov, all brothers are on each other's throat, or their father's throat, except the youngest. So you could say Dostoevsky was the writer of male loneliness. Today, most people find themselves extremely isolated and the majority of men are out of sexual marketplace. Thus, suicide is very high among men. Today, Haruki Murakami is a writer of male loneliness. In Tolstoy's work, family bonds are strong. Therefore, his characters try to be free and often unable to free themselves from their families and duties. In Anna Karenina, Anna desperately tries to divorce her husband, but fails. Dostoevsky's characters are detached from their families, while Tolstoy's characters are attached. Also, this is because of their social class. Dostoevsky's characters are predominantly people of lower socioeconomic status, while Tolstoy's characters are mostly well off, so the family bond is tied to money, heritage, and inheritance. While most of Dostoevsky's characters have none of that. As a result of this freedom, Dostoevsky's characters have psychological issues, while Tolstoy's characters have social or familial issues. Of course, there are exceptions. USSR. When the communists took over in Russia in 1917, they regarded the two writers somewhat differently. Tolstoy was closer to their way of looking at the world through groups, class, and communities. War and Peace was given to Soviet soldiers to improve their morale and promote nationalism because it was about how the Russian spirit had overcome Napoleon a century before. Prokofiev wrote an opera on War and Peace in 1946 at the height of Soviet power, after defeating Hitler and consolidating Eastern Europe. Dostoevsky's individualist approach didn't fit well with the socialist way of seeing the world. But also Dostoevsky's insular views didn't fit in with the spirit of international socialism. Lenin loved Tolstoy and Stalin celebrated him. However, after Stalin, the Soviet leaders slowly returned to their Russian roots, so they celebrated Dostoevsky, especially in the 1970s and onward. Today, Putin finds himself closer to Dostoevsky than Tolstoy, especially on individual freedom, that individuals cannot be trusted if left to their own devices. Having said that, both authors are read in schools and Russians love them both. Now, who is a better writer? This is a very difficult question and the answer is highly subjective. I love Dostoevsky's dark, edgy psychological novels with more drama, with his characters mostly volatile, crazy, irrational, and unpredictable. That madness resonates with me on a deeper psychological level because I think we're all a bit volatile and irrational on the inside. By reading Dostoevsky's novel, you find a kind of release. I think if you are a happy person, you might enjoy Tolstoy, but Dostoevsky was a better writer of human suffering, in my view. Of course, Tolstoy's novels are full of dramas and madness of its own kind, but for the most part, Tolstoy himself was a calm and measured man, and his novels reflect that. You could even say that Dostoevsky was slightly a better storyteller, given his chaotic characters and his focus on crime was also crucial. Crime fiction simply sells more than family drama. To find out who's more popular today, I looked at the reviews and ratings on Goodreads, which is owned by Amazon, the largest bookseller in the world, so it is perhaps an accurate picture of what people read today. If you look at them side by side, Dostoevsky edges Tolstoy on all three metrics. He has more ratings, 1.7 million compared to 1.4 million for Tolstoy. So Tolstoy has almost 400,000 fewer readers than Dostoevsky on Goodreads. It is possible that Tolstoy's readers are older people, therefore less likely to be online. The second metric is reviews. Dostoevsky with 84,000 reviews and Tolstoy with 67,000 reviews. So Dostoevsky has 17,000 more reviews. People have voted with their keyboard. Now, in terms of enjoyment or getting something out of their novels, again, Tolstoy with an average of 4.07, while Dostoevsky is a clear winner by 0.11 points, with an average of 4.18. I don't normally read much into ratings on Goodreads, but these are important stats. My own videos on these two authors also show a huge discrepancy. My video 8 Lessons from Dostoevsky has 230,000 views, while 8 Lessons from Tolstoy has only 1,000 views. Even YouTube is pretty unfair to Tolstoy. I'm only kidding, the video on Dostoevsky was published a year before Tolstoy video. Also, it went viral last December due to 200th year anniversary of Dostoevsky's birth. Joking aside, Dostoevsky resonates with people more today because of his crime genre, also perhaps his religious beliefs. I think today millions of people feel a bit lost, so his writing is deeply psychological and somewhat religious, which resonates with a lot of people seeking meaning for their lives. But perhaps the biggest thing is his dim view of humanity as petty, self-interested, and self-destructive. Today we can see the most visibly in online hatred, the ruthless side of capitalism that has benefited a small minority of elite in society, and the impulsive shopping, drug addiction, and obesity seen throughout the developed world. We aren't as rational as we are meant to be. So Dostoevsky got it right that rationality alone cannot solve all human problems. Tolstoy, despite his happy marriage, social guilt of being born in a rich family, lived a comfortable life. Dostoevsky, however, experienced poverty, spent years in jail in the cold, harsh Siberia. He was a convicted criminal, a lonely man, badly treated and suffered from epilepsy. So in all his writing, he's seeking a kind of warmth, a sense of belonging, acceptance by others, to fill a void, to not be alone. Dostoevsky was like Harry Potter, orphaned without a family, spent the rest of his life seeking the warmth of a family acceptance. Tolstoy, on the other hand, was like Prince Harry or Lord Byron, who couldn't wait to leave his family for some freedom. In fact, Tolstoy spent years womanizing, drinking, gambling, just like Prince Harry. Also, at the end of his life, he did what he always wanted. He ran away from his wife, which resulted in catching pneumonia and his subsequent death at the train station, which is depicted in a 2009 movie, The Last Station. Tolstoy's fascination with train was because of a promise of escape. Anna Karenina is a good example, who falls in love with a man at the train station, witnesses a man dying, and then ends her own life in front of a train. Now, if you have never read any of these authors, let me recommend where you should start. For Dostoevsky, my favorite novel is Crime and Punishment, and my favorite Tolstoy's novel is Anna Karenina. But they are pretty long novels. If you like short stories, then Dostoevsky's White Nights and Tolstoy's How Much Land Does a Man Need are perfect places to start. Both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky remain timeless because of one thing. Both told the truth. Honesty is perhaps the best policy if you want to be a novelist who stands the test of time. They were lucky because honesty is one of the most important characteristics of Russian people, to the point that people find Russians a bit rude. I say they are honest. So both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky told the raw truth, no matter how ugly, and that's why we still read them. Dostoevsky's short story, Belly and Nochy, translated into English as White Nights, was my very first introduction to Russian giant Fyodor Dostoevsky. As a university student of Russian language, I had to translate parts of it into English. At the time, I absolutely hated it because it was simply too hard. As years went by, I fell in love with Dostoevsky's work more and more. So today I'll tell you all about this wonderful short story, which interestingly Dostoevsky wrote in 1848, a year before his hellish Siberian experience, so he was full of optimism, so to speak. But as you can see, there's a deep sadness in him. The story is incredibly deep and moving. It shows Dostoevsky's mastery of storytelling, but also how a story written 174 years ago can cut so deep into our soul, dissecting how lonely we really are in this world. Literature is filled with tales of survival, romances, and heroism, but this story tells one of the most important aspects of human life, the desire for having a company. A friend, someone to spend time with, someone who listens to your story, someone who shares a moment of life with you. It's a tale of loneliness. It makes you appreciate your friend, partner, family members. It's a fantastic portrait of today's world in some way. Summary. Belle Noche or White Nights refer to sunlit summer nights of St. Petersburg, where we meet an unnamed young man who narrates his own story of meeting and falling in love with a lonely 17-year-old girl, Nastenka. Dostoevsky doesn't name his male characters, often perhaps because it's mostly himself or he wants to show a male archetype. Here, a man without a woman. Just in the dream of the ridiculous man, the narrator is a lonely, timid, introvert young man who lives in a tiny apartment in St. Petersburg. He's too shy to approach women, so his only company is his maid, but she is not very sociable. He likes to walk the streets of St. Petersburg at night. Dostoevsky always prefers nights over days. It's the cold, the loneliness, but most importantly, the dark allows freedom from other people's gaze. It's at night that the animal or the deep truth comes out. For our young narrator, he prefers nighttime because during the day he's more impressionable, changing himself based on how others are. But at night he can be more liberated and himself. The story starts thus, quote, "It was a wonderful night, such a night as is only possible when we're young, dear reader. The sky was so starry, so bright that looking at it, one could not help asking oneself whether ill-humored and capricious people could live under such a sky." As he walks, he notices a young woman crying against the canal railing. He's worried, but he's far too timid to approach her to ask what's wrong. After a few steps, he hears the woman scream, so he returns to rescue her from a man harassing her. Dostoevsky wrote it when he was in his 20s, so he had that chivalrous, optimistic energy in him, rescuing a damsel in distress. You could see the ending of this short story brings his cynical side as well. They start talking. The young man confesses his lonely life, introvert personality, and the fear of talking to women. Nastenka is quite understanding and keeps telling him that he is fine. She even lies to him that women do like timid men. Now hearing this, the man tells her how he spends hours and days thinking and imagining meeting a girl who talks to him, who doesn't reject him and who doesn't make fun of him. It's like a floodgate is opened as he talks and talks. He appears like a desperate man, but I assume the ladies of St. Petersburg were pretty brutal in their taste for men. The man doesn't want this experience, being in the presence of a young woman, to end, but soon they arrive at Nastenka's doorsteps. He asks if she wants to meet again. Before she has time to say yes or no, he preempts it by telling her that he will be at the spot they met, whether she comes or not. She agrees to meet the following night under one condition, telling him, "Do not fall in love with me." He promises to be just friends. Well, is that possible? The second night they meet, he further elaborates his life story. Here Dostoevsky alludes to Pushkin's character Eugene, who had read so many books that he no longer sounded like a real person, but a character from some books. The young man tells Nastenka that he has no history because his whole life has been alone, also has been desperate to find someone to be with. Quote, "They are, Nastenka, though you may not know it, strange nooks in St. Petersburg. It seems as though the same sun as shines for all St. Petersburg people does not peep into those spots. Let me tell you that in these corners live strange people, dreamers. The dreamer, not a human being, but a creature of an intermediate sort. For the most part, he settles in some inaccessible corner as though hiding from the light of day. Once he slips into his corner, he grows to it like a snail. Or that remarkable creature which is an animal and a house both at once, and is called a tortoise." He even refers to himself in the third person as the hero of his own imagination because he is too ashamed. To escape his dull life on the outer edge of society, he daydreams. When you spend your life alone, your imagination weaves fantastic, elaborate, and whimsical tales about yourself, meeting your literary heroes, or having a beautiful girl next to you. He also tells her that his favorite time of the day is when everyone is rushing home after work to be with their loved ones. Something deep down he craves to have for himself someday. Once he finishes his tale, Nastenka tells her own story. She grew up with her grandmother and they lived on her pension. To supplement her income, the grandma rented out a room. When her old tenant died, a young man moved in. He began to fancy Nastenka, therefore he gave her romantic novels to read and even took her to Rossini's Barber of Seville, to the point that she too fell in love with him. When it was time for him to leave St. Petersburg for Moscow, she gathered her courage to ask him to marry her. Just like in Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, the girl asks the man, reversing the traditional role. The young tenant refused marriage, saying he was too poor to take care of her. But he promised her that he would return to St. Petersburg and marry her after a year. But now it's been a year and the young man has not come back. There is an old saying that a man can never be truly friends with a woman. By the third night, our young narrator realized that he has fallen madly in love with Nastenka, just like millions of young men secretly wishing to sleep with their female friends. However, our hero hides his true feeling and helps her write a letter to her lover in Moscow. She's moved by this gesture and tells him that because he has not fallen in love with her, she loves him for that. Irony upon irony, he's romantically in love with her while she's platonically in love with him. On the fourth night, Nastenka tells how desperately she's waiting for her lover to return from Moscow. Our narrator comforts her, but at one point he decides enough is enough. He can no longer hold it. He confesses his love for Nastenka. She's shocked as if someone had punched her in the face. Realizing that their friendship is over, he decides to leave and never see her again. Nastenka offers a glimpse of hope, saying that she might grow to reciprocate his love someday. As they walk, they meet a young man. Who could it be? Well, it's the man she's been waiting for. The boy from Moscow grabs the girl and they disappear into the night. Our narrator remains stunned as if he is hit by a missile. The next day at home, he receives a letter from Nastenka thanking him for keeping her company and also inviting him to her wedding the following week. He pauses for a moment and then suddenly breaks into tears. Night after night, he built so much hope and now he's back to zero. He notices his housemate, who looked young, has now suddenly become old with wrinkles. Perhaps for the first time, our lonely narrator can envisage his own old age, perhaps living a lonely life forever. The story ends with him saying that he has nothing against Nastenka, only wishes her the best. Why? Because she gave him the happiest moment of his life, despite his unrequited love. But as for his own life, he tries to be hopeful, but we know his despair may continue. Analysis. The narrator makes three big mistakes. First, when upon meeting a woman who is willing to talk to him, he uses the opportunity to complain about his life. Some people might sympathize with him, but for most people it's off-putting. And especially in Russia, where masculinity requires you to be strong. Everyone has a tough life, so people want to hear solutions, not whining and complaining. Nastenka has sympathy for him, but perhaps deep inside she doesn't respect him. Second, he confesses that he is unable to talk to women. Yet, when he meets her, he cannot stop talking, telling her all his life's problems. You could say this is Dostoevsky's own confessions on the page. Writers write fiction for catharsis, expression, and release because most writers spend long hours alone. But for our narrator, his lack of confidence to talk to women is first met with sympathy, and Nastenka says she prefers shy men. But we know that's not true because she rejected him when he confesses his love to her. Confidence is one of the most important qualities most women look in a man. Confidence triggers admiration, while lack of confidence triggers sympathy. His third problem was that he first agrees with Nastenka not to fall in love with her, but then he does exactly the opposite and he falls in love with her. This flip-flop shows his lack of integrity and principle. Falling in love is natural, biological, so promising not to fall in love is stupid. I think he was hoping if they spend more time, she might fall in love with him, but we know she just needed someone to console while waiting for the dude from Moscow to return. So our narrator made the mistake of investing all his eggs in her basket. Dostoevsky was an incredible psychologist who masterfully depicts the emotional turmoils of a lonely young man. At times the stories are a bit too sentimental, but so are young people who are unable to attract the opposite sex. Also, Dostoevsky was in his 20s when he wrote it. He hadn't gone through the ordeals of Siberia, so he still had a pretty romanticized view of the world. Some 15 years later, after returning from the cold of Siberia, Dostoevsky wrote Notes from Underground, whose narrator very much resembles the narrator in White Nights. Now, he is so disillusioned with society that he has retreated underground. He is no longer seeking company of other humans and even refuses to get treatment for his liver disease. like some injured animal waiting to die. White Knight tells the story of a lonely man. Today, millions of men go through the very same experience. Modernity has made life so much easier that most young men no longer have the courage to talk to women. This is especially true in affluent countries where birth rate is falling rapidly. The modern education system teaches people how to be better workers, but it doesn't teach them how to approach the opposite sex. As a result, a lot of men and women live lonely lives. So my suggestion to you is to go out there and talk to people. The more you talk, the higher likelihood you find someone you like. Dostoevsky's Lonely Man of St. Petersburg tried but failed. However, he took it on the chin and didn't grow resentment or hatred towards Nastenka, or women in general. That's hopeful because I'm sure he learned from the experience and maybe who knows he found someone else. Я человек больной. I'm a sick person. Я злой человек. I'm an angry person. Непривлекательный я человек. I'm an unattractive person. Я думаю, что у меня болит печень. I think there's something wrong with my liver. Впрочем, я не смылся в моей болезни, я не знаю, наверное, что у меня болит. But I don't understand the least thing about my illness, and I don't know for certain what part of me is affected. Я не лечусь и никогда не лечился, хотя медицину и докторов уважаю. I'm not having any treatment for it and never have had, although I have a great respect for medicine and for doctors. Нет, я не хочу лечиться со злости. No, I refuse treatment out of spite. Dostoevsky wrote Notes from the Underground in 1864. That same year, he lost his wife, Maria, and his brother, Mikhail. Despite those personal tragedies, Dostoevsky managed to create a novel that is incredibly profound, funny, and tragic all at the same time. 2 years later, he published his most famous novel, Crime and Punishment. But his most important work is his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, published in 1879, 2 years before his own death. I have reviewed both novels here, but today I'll discuss one of his shortest novels, Notes from Underground, often called the first existential novel. What is it about, why is it important, and what lessons can we learn from the underground man? Before I answer these questions, two things are important to mention here to give a broader context to the novel. First, Dostoevsky wrote it as a response to another Russian novel published a year earlier in 1863 titled What is to be Done by Nikolai Chernyshevsky, which in turn was written in response to Ivan Turgenev's 1862 novel Fathers and Sons. In Fathers and Sons, Turgenev introduced one of the greatest characters in Russian literature, Bazarov, a nihilistic young man with a Western education who believed in destroying everything in Russia, so he could build it in all anew in a Western style. Bazarov was a radical materialist and a rationalist who believed Russian society was rotten, but by the end of the novel, he changes his mind and fails to achieve any of his goals, and ironically dies of a medical mistake. In a way, medicine, the product of rationality, instead of liberating him, ends his life. While Turgenev was trying to warn Russians about the destructive ideology of Bazarov, Nikolai Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, however, took revolutionary materialism as somewhat at a face value. The novel's protagonist is a woman who escapes her family to become financially independent in order to avoid an arranged marriage. It's a novel of freedom through material success. In Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, nihilistic materialism is juxtaposed with romanticism and Russian traditionalism. While Turgenev himself, a romanticist, shows a level of objectivity and let his characters speak for themselves. In What is to be Done, however, Chernyshevsky argues that materialism leads to freedom. Materialism relies on science and rational thinking, which is the core idea of Marxism, and more specifically of Vladimir Lenin, the father of Russian communism. Here's a fun fact. Lenin wrote a Russian version of the Communist Manifesto titled, you guessed it, What is to be Done, in which he says a centralized political party is necessary for a revolution. Thus, the Russian Communist Party, or the Communist Party of the USSR, was born, and in 1917 they overthrew the Tsar, and the rest is history. Also, in Turgenev's novel, the main character, Bazarov, is a rational materialist. And in fact, one of Lenin's close Bolshevik comrades changed his own name to Bazarov to commemorate that fictional hero of Russian Bolsheviks. Now you see how facts and fiction collide in Russia. So, to bring it full circle, Notes from Underground is Dostoevsky's response to Western nihilism encroaching on Russia's soil and destroying Russian traditional values. However, his warning was ignored, and some 70 years later, Russia turned into a socialist state with rational materialism at its core ideology. The second important thing to note is that Dostoevsky was 41 or 42 years old when he wrote Notes from Underground, which is the most precarious period in a man's life when meaning and purpose come to an incredibly sharp focus. And most men experience what is termed as a midlife crisis. The reason for that might be evolutionary. When men get to the age of 40 or around that time, they have a grown son and daughter around 20 or 25, therefore has no other purpose left for him. Or they reach the peak of their career, therefore lose purpose. So Notes from Underground is the confession of a 40-year-old man. The fact that he chose an underground, not a church, for his confession is also important. He knew the Russian intellectuals didn't go to church anymore. He couldn't tell the truth to a priest, but he could tell the truth to his readers. By 1864, Dostoevsky had gone through so many tribulations in life. He had become a successful author after publishing Poor Folk in 1845 at the age of 24. His radical revolutionary ideas led to his arrest, a mock execution, and 10 years in Siberia. He returned to St. Petersburg in 1849, fully transformed from a westernized radical intellectual to someone who had the most disdain for those same intellectuals. So Dostoevsky combined his own midlife crisis with that of Russia's socio-cultural crisis of 1850s into a short novella, made up of only 2 chapters or about 100 pages. The first chapter is very short and has 11 sections in which the unnamed narrator or the underground man introduces himself as a sick man and also articulates his idea about philosophy, human existence, and his rejection of rationality as a solution to Russia's problems or human happiness in general. In the second chapter, which is the bulk of the novel, he narrates his own story of how he was humiliated by an officer and relates his cowardly, botched, and comical attempt to take revenge on him, but the officer doesn't even notice him because he is so insignificant. His second story is how he tried to borrow money from his boss, but found no courage to do so, again in a comical fashion showing his cowardice. Later on, when he forces an invite to a school reunion, his friends show no respect for him. They have a fight and leave him alone, but he follows them to a brothel where he meets a prostitute named Lisa. The name Lisa shows up in many of Dostoevsky's novels, and she represents a kind of unfortunate woman. Lizaveta in Crime and Punishment, the unfortunate sister of the pawnbroker who walks in as Raskolnikov is murdering her sister and therefore becomes victim number 2. In the Brothers Karamazov, Pavel's mother is also named Lizaveta, who gets pregnant with Karamazov's child and then dies at childbirth, and her son ends up killing his father before committing suicide. The underground man feels his life is taking a positive turn when he manages to sleep with Lisa, but then perhaps a post-sex mental clarity allows his bitterness to resurface. Despite his own pitiful life, the underground man looks down on Lisa. He even admonishes her for selling her body and her soul for money. He tells Lisa that her life is futile and meaningless. It is in fact his own life that is meaningless, but now at the position of power, he thinks he can inject his own venom onto her. She leaves him and he is devastated. He curses himself for being so stupid. The way society has treated him, he has become deeply resentful and petty and wanted to enact on it on someone weaker than him, someone like Lisa. Friedrich Nietzsche calls this resentment a slave mentality. Those treated badly become bitter for the rest of their lives, and they try to enact their resentment onto others. A good example is revolutionaries who succeed in toppling a tyrannical regime end up becoming tyrannical themselves, as beautifully depicted in George Orwell's novel Animal Farm. Now, the underground man feels like a total loser. He has nothing to lose, so what does he do? He doesn't become a revolutionary, as Marx claimed that the ideal revolutionaries are those who have nothing to lose except their chains. The underground man, however, goes into himself. He isolates himself from society like a Buddhist monk, or some injured animal that goes somewhere quiet to die away from others. The underground man is physically ill, mainly his liver, but most importantly, he is so deeply psychologically wounded that he no longer wants to receive any treatment for his illness. He has given up. except that he wants to warn us about how modernity, with its rationality-driven progress, can turn us all into someone like him, isolated, dissatisfied, and resentful. Now, what can we learn from Dostoevsky's Underground Man? These 8 lessons will give you a great insight into Dostoevsky's philosophy, psychological analysis of the modern man. 1. We are insignificant. Because I am the nastiest, stupidest, absurdest, and most envious of all worms on earth, who are not a bit better than I am, but the devil knows why, are never put to confusion, while I shall always be insulted by every louse, that is my doom. The underground man suffers from inferiority complex, perhaps due to his lower socioeconomic background. Throughout the novel, he talks about how insignificant he is. Early in the novel, he attempts an act of revenge, but much to his dismay, his nemesis doesn't even notice him. As a result, he develops self-hatred. He says, "For example, I hated my face. I thought it was a scoundrelly face, and I even suspected there was something servile about it. So every time I went to the office, I made agonizing efforts to seem as independent as possible, so they should not be suspected of subservience, and to get my face the most well-bred expression I could manage." This realization leads him underground so he can assess his life in its entirety as a kind of sharp existential mirror. He says, "Now I'm living out my life in my corner, taunting myself with this spiteful and useless consolation that an intelligent man cannot become anything seriously, and it's only the fool who becomes something. Yes, a man in the 19th century must and morally ought to be preeminently a characterless creature. A man of character, an active man, is preeminently a limited creature." So in essence, the underground man is too intelligent or too educated for his own good. His bitterness also comes from the fact that he is not brave enough to act on his ideas. He believes every respectable man has dark secrets, hidden bodies in the closet, so to speak, but he has none of that. His darkest secrets are nothing but a few acts of pettiness. If you don't have secrets, mistakes, bad decisions, or bodies in the closet, for the lack of better terms, you have not done much. And he calls himself a mouse who has crawled underground. This describes the condition of most people. We are insignificant, which can be liberating in a way. 2. I'm a thinking man. Quote, "In order to act, one must be absolutely sure of oneself. No doubts must remain anywhere. But how am I, for example, to be sure of myself? Where are the primary causes on which I can take my stand? Where are my foundations?" The underground man suffers from what he terms as a heightened awareness of oneself, always extremely self-conscious of his own behaviors and thoughts. Why is that? He thinks his heightened self-awareness was the result of his modern education, which he calls a test tube that produces uniformity and cowardice. Therefore, he has lost his natural spontaneity. In a way, he claims that schooling has killed his creativity, but also his courage to be a man of action. This is similar to the superfluous man, a very important character in all Russian literature of 19th century, including in the works of Pushkin, Lermontov, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. Who is a superfluous man? Someone who lives in his head, often romantic, thinks too much, but has little or no initiative to take action. Turgenev compares Shakespeare's Hamlet with Cervantes' Don Quixote. Hamlet thinks without doing anything, while Don Quixote acts without much thought. The underground man is intelligent, but perhaps his social status is not high enough to enact on his ideas. This social impotence leads to his jealousy and psychological bitterness. He wishes he had the power to affect society, or if not power, at least some stupidity to act without thinking. He's a kind of a middle-of-the-road, neither here nor there kind of person. Intellectually superior than most people, but socially inferior than many men of action. This reflects Dostoevsky's own position in Siberia. He was thrown in among the common working-class prisoners, so he watched them with some envy as to how simple their worldview seemed. Dostoevsky, on the other hand, an intellectual, lived in his own head, wishing he enjoyed a bit more stupidity. What education does, it heightens your consciousness. Useful it may be, it can also be a detriment to your own growth and happiness, because it tames you from being a proactive person. 3. The problem of consciousness. Quote, But yet I'm firmly persuaded that a great deal of consciousness, every sort of consciousness, in fact, is a disease. Dostoevsky made childhood the focus of his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, in which he laments the loss of innocence in a kind of blissful ignorance. Because, once seen, nothing can be unseen. The underground man thinks that acute consciousness or being self-aware all the time takes a huge psychological toll on an intelligent man. Quote, "I tell you solemnly that I have many times tried to become an insect, but I was not equal even to that. I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness." For him, consciousness is to truly experiencing emotions such as jealousy, anger, resentment, and revenge, but yet completely unable to take action when experiencing those emotions. He says, "You cannot have a full, genuine consciousness without a pure heart." He feels the full depth of his humiliation because of his acute consciousness. His enemy, the officer, however, is a kind of cool-headed person who doesn't notice things at all, therefore lives in a sort of blissful state. So education nourishes your intellect, and your intelligence heightens your consciousness. He says, I repeat with emphasis, all direct persons and men of action are active just because they are stupid and limited. In other words, they lack acute consciousness, therefore they are more spontaneous. 4. A man of action is spontaneous. Quote, "Well, spontaneous man is the real man. I'm green with envy of such men. They are stupid, I won't deny that, but perhaps a normal person ought to be stupid." The underground man considers a spontaneous person someone close to nature and his natural instincts, while he himself is far removed from his natural state of action because he overthinks and overanalyzes, yet unable to make things happen. When he wanted to borrow money from his boss, it took him forever to knock on the door. Another thing he envies about spontaneous men is their happiness and laughter. They burst out laughing while the underground man observes them with doubt and question fills his head. Despite his jealousy for men of action, he still gives them a backhanded compliment that they are stupid, which limits their thinking process so they act quickly. Modernity, on a very deeper level, is about predictability. In Dostoevsky's time, only factories, armies, and education system were aiming for total control and predictability. But today the world has become so predictable that we cannot cope otherwise. Food must be available in supermarket, drinks in bars, trains on time. Even algorithm predicts what we like to consume online. He says, I admit that twice 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing. But if we are to give everything its due, twice 2 makes 5 is sometimes a very charming thing too. So we humans love predictability, but also surprises. The only time the underground man lets his guards down and becomes spontaneous is after sex with Lisa, or post-sex mental clarity, and as a result he suffers the consequence of her leaving him. 5. Humans are self-destructive. Quote, "But despair can hold the most intense sort of pleasure when one is strongly conscious of the hopelessness of one's position." In Nikolai Chernyshevsky's novel, What Is to Be Done, the Crystal Palace of Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, UK, is seen as the ultimate utopia of material rationalism, a structure made of glass and iron. The underground man says no matter how beautiful such utopia might be, humans are fundamentally self-destructive. It's written in our genes. Quote, "Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Though consciousness is the greatest misfortune for men, yet I know man prizes it and would not give it up for any satisfaction. Consciousness, for instance, is infinitely superior to twice 2 makes 4. Our negative emotions which cause suffering are there for a reason from an evolutionary perspective. We need pain so we can understand our world better. Today we cushion ourselves, shield ourselves from negative things. We have therapy and medicine to protect us. With slightest issue we turn to science to help us. The underground man, despite suffering a serious illness, refuses to get treatment or help. Instead, he has chosen to live alone, which is self-destructive. He even gets pleasure from being humiliated by the officer. So the underground man's approach goes against the self-help industry. Instead, he highlights the self-destructive side of human being. No matter how much we cushion ourselves from negative emotions, they are necessary for us. As I discussed in my video on Marcel Proust, suffering is fundamental to human creativity. Dostoevsky agrees with the underground man that suffering cannot be avoided and there is a real pleasure in pain. 6. We are irrational too. Quote, whether it's good or bad, it's sometimes very pleasant too to smash things. The underground man refuses to get treatment for his illness to make a deeper point. When your body is sick, you're no longer able to make rational decisions. Obesity or addiction to alcohol, drugs, or sex goes against rational thinking. The underground man points out that there are deeper underlying motivations which dictate our choices on a daily basis. But then a simple physical illness can distort your thoughts, or a simple emotional outburst can destroy palaces we spend years to build. Human being is like a game of Jenga. There's always the danger of a small slip. Even a small toothache can change your view of the world. Millions of years of evolutionary hardwiring can't change because modernity requires us to be rational and logical all the time. Dostoevsky has a very low opinion of humanity and paints a picture of human being as something very fragile, malleable, liquid, and unstable. Our nature or our body dictates our lives, so we are chaotic, self-destructive, and often emotionally unstable. Why? Our short-sightedness is because we can't see the bigger picture of our lives. We are in the present and we have little or no knowledge of the future. We are in the midst of our lives. The underground man is suffering from some type of liver disease. Perhaps that has distorted his thoughts about his own self-worth and life. When we are happy for too long, we look for some chaos. When safe, we want fake danger like roller coaster. When peace, we fight over trivial things. The underground man thinks we are hardwired to seek negative emotions in irrational behavior. No matter how much rationality is instilled in us, it cannot control our irrational side, i.e. emotions. 7. Intelligence doesn't make you a better person. Quote, in fact, I believe that the best definition of a man is the ungrateful biped. But that's not all. That's not his worst defect. His worst defect is his perpetual moral obliquity. According to rationalists, being aware of our own self-interest allows us to make intelligent choices. Therefore, if all rational beings make intelligent choices, we can create a society that runs like a machine, predictable and happy. But the underground man has two problems with rational choices. First, intelligence, instead of giving you clarity of thoughts, makes everything appear foggy and blurry, while stupidity, on the other hand, gives you black and white clarity. The underground man concludes that intelligence is futile when it comes to making good choices. He even questions free will, arguing our deeper desires determine most of our choices, without us being aware of it. As an example, your choice of a partner is deeply rooted in your biology, so that's why most people have so much difficulty finding a suitable partner in today's world. Second, he says that intelligent people employ reason as an instrument to distort the truth for their own selfish interest, to the detriment of society as a whole. So intelligence, while highly prized, cannot give you that mental clarity or moral righteousness. It merely heightens your sense of self or ego. The more intelligent you are, the less altruistic you become. 8. The underground man tells stories. Quote, finally, I am bored and I constantly do nothing, and writing things down really seems like work. They say work makes a man good and honest. Well, here's a chance at least. Dostoevsky wrote notes from underground in response to a novel boldly titled, What is to be Done? Now, the underground man's response is to do nothing. He describes himself as lazy and says he's in a state of conscious inertia or inaction. He sounds like a Taoist monk hidden in some remote mountains. He doesn't want to change the world or himself. However, the underground man is not completely lost. He has the desire to write. His confession is shedding lights into the darkness of human psyche. Either consciously or subconsciously, he's trying to help us by telling his own story. It's a teachable moment. He has two important tools in his underground toolshed. First, honesty. He doesn't avert his gaze from the truth at the expense of his own character, describe himself as a mouse, a nasty person, resentful, and a pathetic loser. His honesty is refreshing to read. It's also therapeutic, and I think his confessions here must have helped him to unburden himself a bit. The second tool he employs is comedy. Reading notes from Underground, you cannot stop your laughter from time to time. Despite his Russian pessimism, he has a good sense of humor. Comedy through self-deprecation. Even today, great comedians employ self-deprecation as a tool to create empathy and understanding. The Underground Man is very successful in making the reader empathetic to his condition. So despite thinking that he is a complete loser, he manages to teach us all through the power of storytelling and comedy. His language is also beautiful, that gives us a sense of pathos. Here's an example. The isolated street lamps glimmered sadly through the haze of snow like torches at a funeral. The whole town, country, or even civilization is doomed, and we are burying traditions with our own hands in the name of change and progress. He's telling us that it's time we stop and reflect on things as to where we're heading. The Underground Man lived during a time when therapy didn't exist. He took refuge in solitude. That loneliness is something that endears him to us all, because we are ultimately lonely souls wandering on this rocky planet we call home, while at the same time trying to make sense of it all in our pursuit for meaning and purpose in life. Published in 1866, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky is the most famous Russian novel. While Dostoevsky was exiled to Siberia for his anti-government activities, he met a lot of intellectuals, but also a lot of petty criminals or working-class criminals. He was blown away by their honesty and accepting their guilt. Why? Because they had unburdened themselves by getting solace from religion. Intellectuals, on the other hand, didn't see themselves guilty as they didn't believe in any moral framework. And since they didn't believe in religion, they had to somehow justify their actions. This contrast between intellectuals and the petty criminals shifted Dostoevsky's opinion about the whole crime. So this novel clearly shows that shift. Also, before I summarize the novel, let me define a term in the novel. Self-referentialism simply means that in the absence of God, man is the ultimate moral authority. This can apply to individuals as well as states. For instance, some countries don't abide by international rules because they think they are either above those laws or they don't agree with them. But in this novel, self-referential applies to Raskolnikov, the protagonist of this novel, who thinks he is above the law. Summary. Raskolnikov is a former law student with big dreams in St. Petersburg. He wants to change the world. He wants to be Napoleon. He wants to become a great figure in history. But his poverty means there is a big gap between his dreams and reality. But recently he has learned a few new ideas that have trickled down from Western Europe to Russia. The first idea is utilitarianism, developed by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham and later refined by J. Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism teaches the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. What Raskolnikov understands is that sometimes bad actions can be justified if it benefits more people in the long term, and justifies the means, so to speak. But who can decide if action can be justified by its own means? Now here Raskolnikov has learned another idea. God is dead. In the absence of God, extraordinary people or great people, which he thinks he is one, can set their own morality. What it means that they cannot be held responsible for their actions under the common moral or legal framework. This is called rationalism. These great extraordinary people transcend moral and legal boundaries, which must have influenced Nietzsche's idea of will to power, which I'll discuss later. So our hero Raskolnikov is loaded with these two ideas. A, end justifies the means, and B, great people are above morality and law. He sets his target on an old lady pawnbroker who exploits poor people like him. He calls her a louse, a greedy woman who sucks the blood out of the poor. So here Raskolnikov plays with the idea of socialism too. as if the murder of the old woman would be like a bloody revolution justified to create an equal society. For Raskolnikov, her murder is the first step to his great achievement. He wants to use the money to change his dire financial situation and who knows, perhaps change the world too. He is ready. He has an axe as a physical weapon and two philosophical justifications. What could go wrong? But here comes the big twist. After murdering the pawnbroker, her sister shows up to put a spinner in the works. Raskolnikov thinks he has no choice but to kill her too. This shakes him a lot. A confident young man a moment ago now shakes like a willow tree. He steals some valuable, but not as much as he wanted, because he's too scared. He gets to his room and develops fever and delirium. In the next few days, Raskolnikov goes back and forth whether to confess his crimes to the police or not. This all depends on how much they know or don't know. One day he returns to the scene of the crime, clearly trying to be caught, but the next day he becomes rational again, trying to save himself. It appears inside him there's a titanic battle going on. One pushes him to confess his crimes to the police, the other forces his Western ideologies tell him that he's not guilty and he has nothing to confess. This is the most torturous period in a young man's life. He faints a few times. He refuses to see his mother and sister when they show up in St. Petersburg to see him. In the midst of all his internal turmoils, he meets Sonia, a prostitute whose father was killed in an accident and Raskolnikov happened to be there. He gives his last bit of money to help her with the father's funeral. Raskolnikov feels a little humanity in her, precisely because she is an outcast due to her profession as a prostitute. He feels they are somehow the same in the eyes of society. Then Raskolnikov acts weird again. He asks his best friend, Razumkhin, who seems to have guessed his secret crime, to take him to the detective who investigates the murder. Here we meet Detective Inspector Porfiry, who digs up an article Raskolnikov has written detailing his philosophy about extraordinary people and geniuses being above the law. Raskolnikov senses the police knows something, but passionately defends his article and his ideas. Later, he sees someone shouting murder outside his apartment and disappears. These are all bad signs. Now his fever returns. When Raskolnikov visits Sonia the second time, she reveals that the murdered sister of the pawnbroker was her best friend. Now Raskolnikov, hearing this again, has a shiver up his spine. Sonia also tells him how she copes with her life as an outcast prostitute, a sinner and morally corrupt person in the eyes of society. She says her religious beliefs help her to cope better. Now hearing this, Raskolnikov heads to the police station. He's about to confess, but Detective Porfiry is tormenting him or playing a sort of game of cat and mouse with him. This annoys Raskolnikov, so he again decides not to confess. As they are talking, suddenly another man bursts into the police station and confesses to the murders of the pawnbroker and her sister. Seeing this, Raskolnikov is let go again and he thinks he can get away after all. But the outside world is a terrifying world and he can no longer hold it in, so he confesses his crime to the only person he feels the closest, Sonia. What does she say? She tells him to go to the police right away. She's devastated that he has been torturing himself for this long. She tells him the sooner he confesses, the sooner ends his self-torture. But a sinister man who is trying to marry Raskolnikov's sister has been listening to the confession. He tries to blackmail Raskolnikov to get his sister, but this backfires and the man commits suicide. Now, Raskolnikov's sister also knows the truth. Raskolnikov decides it's time to confess, but Detective Inspector Porfiry tells him he knows everything. This cocky attitude of the police makes Raskolnikov to take a defensive attitude and tries to rationalize his decision not to confess. But then Sonia appears with a cross and that seems to finally seal the deal, and Raskolnikov confesses to the two murders. He's sentenced to 8 years of jail time in Siberia. Sonia follows him there, but it takes Raskolnikov some time in prison to fully feel the guilt. Finally, his new philosophical principles have melted away, ironically in the harsh freezing winter of Siberia. He can finally sleep with a copy of the Bible. He's free from Western ideas in his own grand and dreadful dreams, so the circle is complete. Dostoevsky turned a pompous intellectual into a petty criminal, arguing that no matter how educated or grandiose your plans or thoughts are, we're all the same. We want comfort, mentally and physically. We all need a security blanket, be it religion or art. Dostoevsky prefers religion, for Raskolnikov the only antidote to his Western ideas. But the real antidote to bad idea is the reality of life, the reality of Siberia, the reality of survival. Reality always wins over ideas. As I already discussed, Dostoevsky questions utilitarianism, rationalism, and socialism as moral justifications for selfish human actions. He's saying that in order to achieve a world-changing success, smallest sacrifices aren't okay. Napoleon had created this myth of great men who did great things, but they had to be ruthless. Dostoevsky suggests that Russians weren't really ready for these big ideas. For the time being, religion was the best answer at the time of distress. I think the novel emphasizes responsibility for one's action. Modern humans have learned to justify their actions based on some ideological principles, i.e. socialism, utilitarianism, liberalism, and rationalism. What Dostoevsky is saying, you should strip yourself of all these ideas and take a hard look at yourself. In that sense, it's a very existentialist novel. Nihilism is another theme of this novel, the meaninglessness of modern life. We no longer believe in God and religion doctrines or divine power. We see ourselves as the ultimate power. But we know we are not good at being that ultimate power. Why? Because we cannot be trusted. We get addicted to certain things very quickly. Millions of people gamble, smoke, eat themselves to obesity and endless shopping. Dostoevsky was warning us that individualism and humanism are great ideas, but in reality they make our lives empty of any substance as we crave things we want. We don't need any divine justification, so anything goes. So the moral of the story is that don't follow your dreams at any cost. Dreams are good to have, but they should remain dreams, otherwise they might end up becoming nightmares. That's what Dostoevsky is trying to articulate in this novel. Dostoevsky takes the genre of crime and put it upside down. Crime fiction works either by who has done it, why, or how. Dostoevsky cuts all the bullshit and tells us all those things at the very beginning of the novel. We know it's Raskolnikov, we know why he has murdered 2 women, and we know how he has done it. What is left is what goes on inside a criminal's mind. So this story is from inside out, his internal torment, anguish, and finally confession. Dostoevsky is not interested in the identity of the killer. He's more interested in the humanity or the darkness inside that person. He's like a geologist or archaeologist. He wants to know what makes us human. I think this novel influenced a great many philosophers, including Nietzsche and some French existential philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, and Albert Camus. I think Crime Punishment is one of the most important novels of the past 200 years. Dostoevsky published The Idiot in 1869. It's considered his most personal novel as it deals with themes and experiences which Dostoevsky went through in his own life, namely death penalty, epilepsy, and that deep goodness and innocence that Dostoevsky was seeking throughout his life. On a deeper level, Dostoevsky wished he was a little bit more naive and innocent. For him, once you are exposed to certain ideas, it's impossible to unsee what you have seen. We often use alcohol, drugs, and often other things to numb that pain of knowing things. The most devastating thing in this novel is the awareness that death is the end of you. Yes, once you die, you go kaput. Nothing remains of you. No soul flies to heaven. Dostoevsky grappled with this idea throughout his life, and he called consciousness as a disease. So The Idiot is an attempt to find an antidote to suffering. In this video, I'll summarize the novel, then discuss its major themes such as religion, death penalty, money, different kinds of love, and finally Dostoevsky's ultimate message in this novel. So get yourself a cup of coffee and some popcorn. Summary Part 1. The Russian word idiot is the same as the English word idiot. It is a way to insult someone. But Dostoevsky's character is not an idiot, he's innocent. A grown-up child, so to speak. His name is Lev Mishkin, which Lev means lion, also Tolstoy's name, and Mishkin means mouse. So in other words, a lion on the inside and a mouse on the outside. Everyone thinks he's a mouse or idiot, but he's in fact a lion who sees truth nobody else can see. So to set the scene, Dostoevsky uses the train as a starting point where his protagonist, Prince Mishkin, is returning after 4 years in Switzerland where he's been recovering from epilepsy. As Tolstoy famously said, all great literature is either a stranger goes to town or the hero takes journey. Here we have Mishkin who is returning to Russia after years abroad to meet his distant relative, Lizaveta Prokofievna, the wife of a big dude in St. Petersburg, General Epanchin. Lizaveta is a recycled character in most of Dostoevsky's novel who symbolizes a good but often an unlucky woman. This mirrors Dostoevsky's own return to St. Petersburg after years of exile in a Siberian labor camp. So instead of some nice Swiss cheese and lots of cows roaming around, all Dostoevsky saw was snow and cold and hard work. Prince Mishkin, however, is called the idiot because he's a very mild-mannered, good-hearted 26-year-old man, almost childlike in his innocence, as if he grew up outside society in some remote mountain among cows and sheep. If he was to return from Siberia, he would have been bitter, resentful and cold. So Dostoevsky knew to make Prince Mishkin work, he had to come from Switzerland, the most neutral country in Europe, where Dostoevsky lived while writing the novel in 1867 and 68. Switzerland never goes to war, and that's why they have all the world's money stored in Swiss banks. Very smart. But the idiot Mishkin is broke at the start of the novel. Later, he gets a big chunk in inheritance. On the train sitting next to Prince Mishkin, we also meet another important character, Rogozhin, who has inherited a lot of money, therefore he wants to get married. In complete contrast to Mishkin's calm and measured manner, Rogozhin, the son of a rich businessman, is extremely passionate, almost madly in love with a beautiful lady called Nastasia Filipovna. Prince Mishkin represents the old aristocrats while Rogozhin represents the new business class. This mirrors how Russia was changing at the time. Mishkin is poor while Rogozhin now has a fortune. This chance encounter on the train in the beginning of the novel is mirrored by a horrific scene at the end of the novel where both Mishkin and Rogozhin come together again. Mishkin represents innocence while Rogozhin represents animalistic passion. Mishkin doesn't judge your past, so he lives in the present. Mishkin is the nice guy while Rogozhin is the bad boy. Who is in the middle of all this? Nastasia Filipovna is perhaps Dostoevsky's strongest female character in all his novels. She was orphaned as a child, raised by a ruthless aristocrat, Tolstoy, who wanted to raise her for his own sexual gratification. But she has grown up to be a very clever, socially acute woman who can see through men's intentions. But her superpower is her beauty. Men fall to their knees in her presence, so she has many suitors. But the problem with beauty is that everyone wants you, but only one person can have you. We have a problem here, so the battle commences. First we have Ganya, who wants to marry her. Here's a secret though. Ganya doesn't love Nastasia, but Tolstoy, Nastasia's guardian, has promised Ganya a lot of money if he agrees to marry her and takes her away from him. Why? Well, Tolstoy has his eyes on another woman. Also, Nastasia is too clever for him. He wants a more submissive woman. So we are only in the first round. Nastasia Filipovna rejects Ganya, who's humiliated and utterly beaten. Who's next? Rogozhin shows up with a huge sum of money to win her over. Prince Mishkin, the total outsider in all this, also raises his hand that he wants to marry Nastasia Filipovna. She looks at him and says, why? Mishkin doesn't talk about his goodness. Instead, he shows his bank balance, that he has received a huge sum in inheritance too. The reason these men talk with their money is that women are practical. They don't look for good men, they look for competent men who can provide for them. Also, now that Mishkin has money, he is no longer an idiot, and everyone wants to be his friends. I wish I had money so I could have some friends. Now, she has a choice to make. Should she go with Mishkin, the good man with money, or should she go with Rogozhin, the bad boy with money? It's a real dilemma that nearly all women face in their lives. The good guy isn't exciting but reliable. The bad boy is unreliable or unpredictable but exciting. As expected, Nastasia, seeking excitement, chooses Rogozhin. Bad boys always win in the first round. Also important to note that Nastasia Filipovna has terrible sexual experience growing up. So those traumas influenced her decision making. The fact that she didn't have parents means she makes bad choices in life. Picking Rogozhin is one such choice. Rogozhin has won the battle, but not quite. Although he has her, he also thinks her heart is with someone else. Rogozhin thinks even though they are together, Nastasia loves Mishkin. In other words, he has her shell, but her inner self is with Mishkin. Rogozhin being the bad boy, he is capable of violence, of course. With passion comes jealousy. Mishkin discovers that Rogozhin beats Nastasia somewhat regularly. Mishkin here plays the role of the knight who tries to rescue a damsel in distress. But the problem is that he neither has the physical power nor the authority to compete with Rogozhin. He is likened to the poor knight, a character in one of Alexander Pushkin's poems. But what's worse, Rogozhin even threatens to kill her in his rage. And he also attacks Mishkin with a knife in an attempt to kill him. Here Dostoevsky uses a very clever device to save his protagonist. Just as Rogozhin is about to stab him with his knife, Mishkin has an epileptic seizure. Rogozhin has no idea what's happening, so he flees like the roadrunner. Having an illness is sometimes handy. Mishkin survives. Meanwhile, Mishkin also has an eye on another woman, Aglaya, the daughter of his relative Lizaveta and Epanchin. Aglaya is also intrigued by Mishkin but has little respect for him, thinking he's really an idiot. Aglaya wishes Mishkin was a bit more confident of himself and to stop being humble all the time. Here's an advice for men watching this: women want you to be confident, so don't show too much humility. Aglaya indirectly tells Mishkin to be more manly and teaches him how to use gun, how to win duel. Here Dostoevsky shows his understanding of how women want to change a man whom they can love, to turn the childlike Mishkin into a strong-willed man. Women don't want a grown-up child. They want a strong man who can protect and provide for them. There's a lot of back and forth between the two. Aglaya is conflicted about Mishkin, her biggest problem that he has no passion and seems too stupid with his innocence. Her parents want them married. Will Dostoevsky turn Mishkin into a passionate man? The saying is that everyone has a passion, but not everyone gets the chance to show it. Okay, it's time Dostoevsky brings some ideological debate into the mix. Perhaps we might see Mishkin in his element. Who knows what Aglaya might think about him then? Meanwhile, Dostoevsky interrupts the main plot by introducing a commonly recycled character in all his novels, an atheist nihilist. He's called Ippolit, who is convinced that religions are nothing but lies and your soul dies with you. He talks about a painting, The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb by Hans Holbein the Younger, in which Jesus is buried and nature is slowly decomposing him. There's nothing one can do to stop the course of nature. No God is powerful enough to stop it. Interestingly, Mishkin doesn't confront him in his ideas, but later on when it comes to Catholicism, he confronts it head first. This shows Dostoevsky's own inability to really have a good answer against the powerlessness of God and protecting the weak, especially children, against the cruelty of nature. So, since there is no meaning in life, suicide is the only option. Ippolit shoots himself in front of everyone, but despite the fact there's no bullet is fired, he faints like a rabbit in the headlights. Like all Dostoevsky's atheist characters, Ippolit is scared of his own ideas. I wonder if Dostoevsky thought courage was only possible with blind faith, religious, nationalistic, or romantic. In other words, if you believe in something, you are capable of having a real courage. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov develops fever, delirium, and real mental panic after he kills the woman, despite his philosophical justifications for the murders. In Brothers Karamazov, Ivan goes mad after realizing that his idea may have influenced the death of his own father. For Dostoevsky, if you are an atheist or nihilist, you are a real coward when it comes to real courage. You talk the talk, but not walk the walk. I have said this many times. For the Russians, courage is the ultimate value for a man. Summary Part 2. So the Little Ippolit episode brings the question as why everyone in the West has turned into atheists. Why all of a sudden people look down on Christianity. It's time we see Mishkin show some passion. God damn it. Mishkin, at one point during a dinner party organized by Aglaya's parents, becomes extremely passionate in his attack on Catholicism for its heavy-handedness political rule. He claims that because the Catholics were power-hungry people, they gave Christianity a bad reputation, and this caused many people to flee Christianity into the bosom of atheism and nihilism. For Mishkin, Catholicism is even worse than atheism for its cruelty. Quote, Roman Catholicism is, in my opinion, worse than atheism itself. Yet that's my opinion. Atheism only preaches a negation, but Romanism goes further. It preaches a disfigured, distorted Christ. It preaches Antichrist, I assure you, I swear it. This is my own personal conviction. It has long distressed me. The Roman Catholic believes that the Church on earth cannot stand without universal temporal power. He cries, non possumus. In my opinion, the Roman Catholic religion is not a faith at all, but simply a continuation of the Roman Empire. And everything is subordinated to this idea, beginning with faith. The Pope has seized territories in an earthly throne and has held them with sword. And so the thing has gone on, only that to the sword they have added lying, intrigue, deceit, fanaticism, superstition, swindling. They've played fast and loose with the most sacred and sincere feelings of men. They have exchanged everything for money, for base earthly power. And is this not the teaching of Antichrist? How could the upshot of all these be other than atheism? Atheism is the child of Roman Catholicism. It proceeded from these Romans themselves, though perhaps they would not believe it. It grew and fattened on hatred of its parents. It is the progeny of their lies and spiritual feebleness. Atheism. In our country, it's only among the upper classes that you find unbelievers, men who have lost the root or the spirit of their faith. But abroad, whole masses of people are beginning to profess unbelief. At first because of the darkness and lies by which they were surrounded, but now out of fanaticism, out of loathing for the Church and Christianity. This debate is more elaborated in the Brothers Karamazov's most famous section, The Grand Inquisitor, in which Jesus is detained in Spain for being too nice. You can't rule people with kindness. You can only rule people with brute force, which the Catholic Inquisition was all about. Mishkin continues despite making everyone uncomfortable, but he lets it all out. The man for the very first time shows passion in his conviction. He's a Russian man after all. If you had doubt about Dostoevsky, now you should know that he was a true psychologist. Mishkin's passionate outburst has done its job. Soon he finds himself in Aglaya's arms. Now she loves him. She has been desperately waiting to see him with passion. Now Mishkin's outburst against the Catholic Church is not the point, but for Aglaya, the man has passion about something. Now it has ignited Aglaya's own passion, so much so that she attacks Nastasia Filipovna, which shocks Prince Mishkin. We have a lot of drama now, but what comes out of it is a huge shock for everyone. Nastasia Filipovna asks Mishkin to marry her. Why? Well, Mishkin has another woman, Aglaya, which makes him more attractive now for Nastasia. It's all a game, or the tag of romance. The prince agrees to abandon Aglaya, the woman who turned him into a suitable candidate. Instead, he wants to marry Nastasia. Mishkin, what are you doing? Nobody saw that coming. Aglaya is devastated, and so is her family. Mishkin tries to explain, but nobody listens to him, and everyone calls him with his nickname, Idiot. Is he an idiot? We'll find out on the day of his wedding with Nastasia Filipovna. Yes, Mishkin is an idiot, of course. Nastasia Filipovna doesn't show up at her wedding, instead runs away with, you guessed it, the bad boy Rogozhin. The idiot Mishkin continues in his wedding's attire as if nothing has happened. Once he has greeted all the guests, which takes him a whole day, he goes in search of his bride, Nastasia. What an imbecile. By the time he finds her, it's too late. You cannot have a Dostoevsky novel without a good old murder. Mishkin discovers Nastasia's dead body in a pool of blood. Who is the killer? We all know. Rogozhin, the bad boy, the man with passion. Mishkin shows no emotion here. Instead of admonishing Rogozhin or attacking him or taking revenge, Mishkin says nothing. The two men, rivals, enemies, and opposites, sit together all night to watch over the dead body of the woman they both loved. Dostoevsky, having spent years in the harshest conditions Siberia for his crime, didn't believe in retribution or revenge or punishment. You cannot undo a deed by punishing the person. In the beginning of the novel, Mishkin also says that he is against death penalty. Quote, I believe that to execute a man for murder is to punish him immeasurably more dreadfully than is equivalent to his crime. A murder by sentence is far more dreadful than a murder committed by a criminal. The man who is attacked by robbers at night in a dark wood or anywhere undoubtedly hopes that he may yet escape until the very moment of his death. But in the case of an execution, that last hope, having which it is so immeasurably less dreadful to die, is taken away from the wretch, and certainty substituted in its place. There is his sentence, and with it, that terrible certainty that he cannot possibly escape death, which I consider must be the most dreadful anguish in the world. This reflects Dostoevsky's own view because he was almost executed by the Tsar in 1849. When facing death, humans cling to a certain beauty, art, religion, or a memory. At one point, Mishkin talks about a man who remembered while waiting for his execution, which is more likely to be Dostoevsky's own memory of his own experience. Quote, he said that those 5 minutes seemed to him to be a most interminable period, an enormous wealth of time. He seemed to be living in these minutes so many lives that there was no need as yet to think of that last moment, so that he made several arrangements dividing up the time into portions. One for saying farewell to his companions, 2 minutes for that, then a couple more for thinking over his own life and career, all about himself, and another minute for the last look around. While saying goodbye to his friends, he recollected asking one of them some very usual everyday question, and being much interested in the answer. Then, having bade farewell, he embarked upon those 2 minutes which he had allotted to looking into himself. He knew beforehand what he was going to think about. He wished to put it to himself as quickly and clearly as possible that there was he a living, thinking man, and that in 3 minutes he would be nobody, or if somebody or something, then what and where. He thought he would decide his question once for all in these last 3 minutes. A little way off there stood a church, and its gilded spire glittered in the sun. He remembered staring stubbornly at this spire, at the rays of light sparkling from it. He could not tear his eyes from these rays of light. He got the idea that these rays were his new nature, and that in 3 minutes he would become one of them, amalgamated somehow with them. The world would have been without Dostoevsky's greatest novel if he was executed at such a young age. So Mishkin is devastated but doesn't do anything against Rogozhin, which is perhaps the heaviest burden on Rogozhin. He wished he was punished for what he did. The Russian state, however, punishes Rogozhin by sentencing him to 15 years of hard labor in, you guessed it, Siberia. The English used to send theirs to Australia, the Russians send theirs to Siberia to tame the wilderness. Our Russian tragedy is over, and Mishkin returns to Switzerland to recover from it all. Russia wasn't ready for a good man like him, just like the Roman Empire wasn't ready for Jesus. Lucky for Mishkin, they didn't crucify him, but they broke his soul. At the beginning of the novel, everyone joked about him being an idiot. By the end, he goes insane to make him the Russian Don Quixote who tried to save Nastasia, but by virtue of his interference, she ended up dead. You could say it was a botched attempt by an idiot knight to rescue a damsel in distress. Aglaya ends up running away with a Polish man who turns out to be a Catholic. Oh boy. Don't tell Mishkin about that. He hated the Catholics. Is Switzerland a Catholic country? But Mishkin remains inside a sanatorium, so he won't see any churches in the distance. I wonder if Mishkin was there when Thomas Mann wrote his novel The Magic Mountain, also set in a sanatorium in Switzerland. Analysis. Death penalty. Dostoevsky makes a clear case against death penalty in this novel through words of Prince Mishkin. Dostoevsky experienced it firsthand before his Siberian exile. Dostoevsky says if someone wants to kill you, there's a slim chance that that person may fail. Just like Rogozhin failed to kill Mishkin with a knife. But when the state executes you, you have zero chance of survival. So the psychological experiences are very different. One is a certain death, and the other you have a chance of survival. As animals, we have evolved to believe that we always have a chance of survival. But with the state choosing to kill you, you no longer have that chance. But the worst part of it is the waiting. It is excruciatingly painful, the hours, the minutes as you wait your execution. Dostoevsky, who went through the horrifying ordeal himself, says no matter how terrible a crime you may have committed, the state has no right to take you alive. Epilepsy. When reading Charles Bukowski, I came across a passage in which he describes how one experiences pain in front of other people. Other things you look stupid when you publicly experience pain. So Dostoevsky tackles the same issue. Epilepsy is a public illness. It exposes you in front of others. It can come at any moment. and it makes you look dumb and idiotic in front of others. With every seizure, you look stupid, so the novel's title also refers to the illness, I think. Prince Mishkin suffers from epilepsy, thus called an idiot. As a child, I witnessed a boy having seizure. I remember my mixed emotion. On the one hand, I felt sorry, but on the other, I felt how stupid he looked, because I didn't know what he was doing at first. Dostoevsky himself develops epilepsy after his Siberian exile. Many great authors had epilepsy, which must have contributed in their decision to stay indoor and write instead of going outside in case of an attack. Alcohol. Whether the stereotype that Russians drink a lot is a myth or real, in this novel it's totally true. In nearly every party there are many who are completely wasted and they start to say things to create chaos. In the absence of religion, alcohol is your best mate to numb your pain. That's why Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, but today it's alcohol or shopping. Alcohol is a bigger problem among the poor in this novel. Those of a higher socioeconomic status drink moderately, but those at the bottom drink like there's no tomorrow. In some cases, unfortunately, there is no tomorrow. Money. Money is pretty central in the novel. From the first scene, money and marriage go hand in hand. Rogozhin inherits a lot of money. He chases Nastasia. She weighs men against their money. Mishkin is poor, then rich. Then people follow him like scavengers follow a dead carcass, trying to prove that they are his real cousins or friends. When money goes missing, everyone is a suspect. Without money, forget about marriage and love. It's the same today. If you're a poor man, forget about romance. Love. There are three kinds of love. Rogozhin's love is passionate, animalistic, which attracts Nastasia. She chooses him every time for his raw, impulsive passion. Mishkin's love is a bit religious, based on pity. This was Nietzsche's biggest problem with religion, for promoting weak-mindedness. Nietzsche might say the reason Nastasia chooses the bad boy Rogozhin is that he represents nature, while Mishkin represents religion that suppresses nature. Mishkin feels sorry for Nastasia, but also wants to marry her. It's confusing. I think Dostoevsky himself wasn't really convinced by Mishkin's stance. Despite being a really innocent man, a woman doesn't love you unless she knows where you stand, unless she respects your position, unless she can understand where your passion is. I guess Dostoevsky was trying to show that religious love is misunderstood by people. Garnier's love is based on getting promoted. He uses love as a social ladder, so he is opportunistic. Rogozhin's love is animalistic and natural. Mishkin's love is religious. Dostoevsky doesn't make women in the novel to prove their love for these men. It's only men who are on trial to prove their love. I guess women do the choosing, so it's a hard job on itself. They get pregnant and have to live with a man she chooses, so it's far greater risk for her than for the man. Religion. Religion is prominent here. Dostoevsky shows that Orthodox religion is superior to Catholicism as it stays away from political power. Atheism confronted Dostoevsky throughout his life. He tried to show that religion, despite not being the sharpest tool in the shed, is still relevant for millions of Russians. Despite its religious theme, Dostoevsky doesn't shove it in our throats. There are many nuanced moments when religion has no answer to atheism, like how all-the-powerful God allows injustice and cruelties towards children. At the end, Jesus-like character Prince Mishkin goes mad because he couldn't even prevent a single murder, which I think he was partially responsible for. If he hadn't declared his love for Nastasia, she and Rogozhin might have had a somewhat decent marriage, who knows? But the main message is that no matter how bad you are, you can redeem yourself. Nobody is just evil or just good, we're both. For as long as you live, you have the chance to do great things and terrible things, make mistakes and amend them. Mishkin, aka Dostoevsky, sees goodness in everyone. He doesn't judge people, unless you're a Catholic, of course. Instead of responding to atheist claim, in them he recognizes his own past struggles with the same ideas. But ironically, when it comes to the Catholics, oh boy, he goes on a rant with so much passion and conviction. I know there's a lot of people who box Dostoevsky as a Christian novelist. I think that is a huge disservice to his brilliant writing. He understood that rationality alone cannot save us, because humans are deeply flawed. So to describe humans as rational is like forcing a square peg into a round hole. Dostoevsky couldn't accept that death was the end of everything. So I say his death was not the end of Dostoevsky because he created something amazing, and that is art. The Idiot is one of them. Dostoevsky says, quote, "The important thing is life and nothing else. If you don't care about others, people think you're an idiot. A Zen Buddhist monk or an ascetic man might appear like idiots because they don't care about worldly positions or how others think of them. Great wise people tend to appear to us a bit childlike, innocent, and even stupid on the outside." Dostoevsky's Prince Mishkin is a man who has remained a child. He sees goodness in people. He doesn't try to show that he's smarter, faster, and wiser. If you're happy on the inside, it doesn't matter what other people think about you or calling you an idiot. But here's a problem. At different stages in our lives, we have different goals. When young, we seek a partner, a career, worldly success, and more. But later in life, we slow down, appreciate the little things, or seek happiness on the inside. In the East, in the past, people turned to Buddhism at a later stage in their lives because their worldly pursuit didn't make them happy or fulfilled. So the Buddhist philosophy of non-detachment allowed people to find peace on the inside. Dostoevsky's Mishkin is only 26 years old, so he's too young for Buddhism, and he's half the age of Don Quixote, who was 50, so he's slightly confused at times. He wants to help people, but as a result, he causes more problems. He's neither detached from nor attached to other people and his own worldly desires. He wants to marry 2 women, but also tries to say he's not interested in them for sex or lust. His mixed signals result in one woman getting killed and the other very unhappy. He fits the stereotype of a nice man. You know the saying, the nice men finish last. But Dostoevsky's message is that one should not worry about how others judge you. As long as the core inside you makes you happy and fulfilled, other people's opinions about you should not matter. Even if everyone thinks you're an idiot, nothing can penetrate you if you have peace on the inside. Dostoevsky goes even further. If you find peace on the inside, the outside world is irrelevant. I'll leave you with this quote. "I used to watch a line where earth and sky met, and longed to go and seek there the key of all mysteries, thinking that I might find there a new life, perhaps some great city where life should be grander and richer. And then it struck me that life may be grand enough even in a prison." What is the oldest human conflict? A conflict present in all societies, cultures, and periods in history. It is, of course, the conflict between generations. The youth want change and the old want to keep traditions going. This generational conflict is built in or pre-installed in human biology, which drives evolution. But sometimes the youth want radical change, not evolution, but a bloody revolution. Here's a question. Did Fyodor Dostoevsky predict the Russian Revolution of 1917, some 50 years before it happened? Dostoevsky's novel Demons centers on a radical young man who brings a bloody socialist revolution in a Russian town. Here's an interesting twist or historical irony. As Dostoevsky was writing Demons in the same year, 1870, one of the most influential Russian babies was born, who grew up to do exactly what Dostoevsky was writing about, changing Russia's history forever. It was Vladimir Lenin, whose socialist revolution in 1917 set up the USSR, a kind of replica of Dostoevsky's fictional revolution. Incidentally, Dostoevsky's novel Demons was published in 1871, but apparently Lenin refused to read it because he considered it reactionary garbage. Who knows what might have happened had he read the novel as a boy or teenager. Dostoevsky's Demons is not only a political satire but also a psychological drama and a social tragedy set in Russia after the emancipation of serfs in 1860s, which is also the golden age of Russian literature that gave birth to 3 masterpieces: Turgenev's Fathers and Sons in 1862, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in 1866, and Tolstoy's War and Peace in 1869. Outside literature, the 1860s was a politically volatile and idea-charged period where westernized radicals fought the Russian traditionalists. Today I'll summarize Demons, consider one of Dostoevsky's most important novels, and later discuss some of the themes such as nihilism, hedonism, and suicide. I will also compare Dostoevsky's Demons to Turgenev's masterpiece Fathers and Sons, and how they depict nihilism differently. Also, to make it interesting, Dostoevsky has a character in the novel based on Turgenev himself, which I think puts Dostoevsky in a somewhat negative light. Bessie in Russian, translated to English as the possessed or the devils or demons, is a first-person narrative by Anton G., a civil servant and close friend of the main intellectual Stepan Verkhovensky, who is the inspiration behind the radical youth. Anton is somewhat similar to Dostoevsky himself, who was part of a radical group in his own youth, so he knows the characters inside out, almost omniscient. He fondly remembers the younger days of Stepan as a promising young man with a university career ahead of him, but his radical Western ideas prevented him to get a job. Instead, he's employed as a personal tutor by Varvara Stavrogina to teach her son, Nikolai Stavrogin, a young aristocrat who becomes the main and the most complex character of the novel. Stepan is an older man, a westernized intellectual who has a big influence on the young people, including his own son, Pyotr Verkhovensky, who is another important character and the main instigator of a socialist revolution. Just like all Dostoevsky's novels, there are far too many fully developed characters, but I'll focus on the intellectual Stepan, but more in the background, his son Pyotr as the main revolutionary protagonist, and Nikolai, whom Pyotr wants to recruit because of his aristocratic influence. The westernized Pyotr Verkhovensky, similar to Vladimir Lenin some decades later, orchestrates a revolution. The aristocrat Nikolai Stavrogin, the main and the most charismatic character in the novel, opposes the revolution, but not with all his energy. Why? The aristocrat has some dark secrets himself, so he is preoccupied to cover his own dirty laundry. Pyotr looks up to the charming Nikolai and tries to recruit the aristocrat in his revolutionary causes. Stepan Verkhovensky, Pyotr's father and Nikolai's teacher, represents the idealistic group of westernized intellectuals. But now that he is a bit older and wiser, he is not eager to promote revolution and chaos. Ivan Shatov, a fierce enemy of westernized Pyotr, is another idealist who favors the Russian Orthodox culture and faith, himself having gone through a radical Western phase as a young man, just like Dostoevsky himself did before his Siberian exile. Ivan Shatov is partly religious and partly nationalistic, again just like Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was reformed in Siberia, but Ivan Shatov is reformed through his travels in Europe and Russia. He is a Slavophile who believes in the Orthodox faith, Russian soil, and peasants. Again very similar to Dostoevsky himself. Pochvenechstvo, meaning return to soil, which was a 19th century movement in Europe and Russia, somewhat similar to Romanticism based on championing certain people or ethnicity, with its extremist version being fascism. But here it meant promoting unity among various groups of Slavic people. Ivan Shatov's housemate, Alexei Krylov, an engineer who seems like a Christian socialist, is seeking to sacrifice himself for the good of society, just like Jesus. He's a deep thinker, perhaps the thinking side of Dostoevsky himself. I think Dostoevsky noticed the similarities between socialism and Christianity, as they both promoted equality, fairness, and promised a heaven-like utopia, but their method of achieving such utopia are radically different. It's autumn before the cold of Siberia hits Russia. We are in a small provincial town somewhere in Russia. Instead of gathering firewoods for the cold winter, the people in this town are organizing a ball to get drunk and recite poetry, but that's on the surface. In reality, it's not a ball, it's a bloody coup or revolution that chops people's balls, not literally though. We meet the intellectual Stepan Verkhovensky, our spiritual leader and teacher to the young people in the novel, whose promising career prospect vanished due to his radical ideas. Instead of becoming a university professor, he has been living in the house of a wealthy landlady, Varvara Stavrogina. He was initially employed as a tutor to educate her son Nikolai, the young aristocrat who becomes the main character in the novel. But as years passed, he found himself comfortable there, and the landlady also enjoys his platonic company and his intelligence and artistic mind. Varvara has just returned from Switzerland to talk to Stepan about his money problem, but most importantly discuss some unsavory rumors that has been circulating about her son Nikolai, whom Dostoevsky likens to the playboy Prince Harry, not that one, but the one in Shakespeare's play Henry V and IV. The young Nikolai is a man of many contradictions, with bad boy tendencies, also cynical and almost amoral, who manipulates women to sleep with him in his hedonistic pursuits. In the past, he was also involved in a duel, pulled someone's nose, and even did Mike Tyson on someone by biting his ear. Varvara first twists Stepan's ears for spending too much money and tells him to be more responsible with his credit card. You're a grown man, goddammit. But her real concern is her son's liaison with a few women, the beautiful Lisa, her friend's daughter, the reliable Dasha, her own protege, and a mentally handicapped woman called Maria. To resolve this entanglement, Varvara forces Stepan to marry Dasha to hit two birds with one stone. It solves his money problem, but also takes her away from Nikolai to hide some sinister secrets in the family, which Stepan eventually realizes. There's a lot going on in the state, and it all has to do with the young aristocrat Nikolai, who's been having a lot of fun with multiple women, even marrying Maria, who seems to be mentally challenged. Her mother Varvara tries everything to keep a lid on the scandals through money, coercion, and persuasion, but she can only do so much. But this is not only a family drama, it's a Russian social drama. The hedonist Nikolai is a mere representative of Russian aristocracy, lazy, womanizing, and pleasure-seeking. We have a meeting where everything comes to a head. Dostoevsky is a master of putting various characters together to confront one another and have an open, volatile discourse. It's like a percussion orchestra. A large sum of money is involved, a secret marriage, and many disordered activities. It's like the Jeremy Kyle show or the Oprah's soap opera, where everyone screams and people show up suddenly from nowhere. Nikolai himself, the subject of the scandals, is conveniently absent from the meeting. But another young man shows up, a stranger who starts over-talking everyone in the meeting. Who could it be? It is our revolutionary Pyotr, Stepan's son. A man with a plan, but we don't know what his real plan is. Then suddenly Nikolai shows up and takes away Maria while telling everyone that he's not married to her. Once Nikolai is gone, Pyotr, the revolutionary, tells Varvara that Maria's mental illness forced Nikolai to look after her, and that's why she believed this was marriage. He paints her son as a noble man who rescued a sick woman, not someone who took advantage of her. We know what Pyotr is up to here. He has a ruthless plan to ingratiate himself with Nikolai by rescuing him from his scandalous life, so that the aristocrats become the patron of his socialist revolution. If you can't beat the system from outside, beat it from the inside through what you could term as blackmail. His plan is to blackmail all the influential people in town. Then it's an easy revolution where you don't have to call an army. Pyotr makes up some other stories to corroborate Nikolai's innocence in all this. Lady Varvara is happy that her son is a good man after all, but Pyotr wants his father out of his plans. How can he remove him from the scene? He lies about his father Stepan, confessing that he's being forced to marry Dasha. Varvara is shocked to hear this, so she tells Stepan to pack his bag and leave immediately. Dasha's brother Ivan Shatov, Pyotr's arch enemy, who's been silently watching everyone, walks up to Nikolai and does a Will Smith on him by smacking him in the face. The beautiful Lisa faints. The first drama is over. This was just a prelude, so the main course will sacrifice a few cows, people, because we will have a revolution. Just remember, it's fiction. Summary Part 2. The Stavrogin family scandal spreads like a wildfire. Everyone is too ashamed to be involved in the drama, so they hide themselves from social media. The town's gossip. But one man is out there talking to everyone on YouTube, on radio, and on TV. He's out there talking to people on the streets, cafes, and everywhere. He's not afraid of the gossip. It's our young revolutionary socialist Pyotr. Here we also learn about his cunning plan to recruit Nikolai, the most powerful and influential aristocrat, for his revolutionary cause. Nikolai understands his own terrible predicament, however shows a cold shoulder, but doesn't refuse him overtly either. He has a bigger problem. His own life is on the line. Someone whom he had insulted a while back has challenged him to a duel. We are in Russia, baby. But as it turns out, he survives the duel. Dostoevsky doesn't want to kill him yet. Nikolai, in search of a backer for his duel, comes face to face with Ivan Shatov, who instead of slapping again, confronts him about his hypocrisy of pretending to be a Christian on the one hand and making false promises of marriage to women on the other. Nikolai tries to explain his religious conviction, but it's pretty lame. So he tries scare tactics, saying that because Ivan Shatov was a former revolutionary himself and now reformed, he is being hunted down by his former comrades, including Pyotr. After leaving that frightening seed inside Shatov's mind, Nikolai leaves him alone to brood. Nikolai goes to Maria, his alleged wife, telling her to escape with him to Switzerland for some peace and some Swiss cheese. Nikolai has had enough of Russia and its endless dramas. But Maria is deeply dismayed by his previous action of disowning her in front of everyone. She thinks the man has no backbone. She tells him no. Nikolai's patience is at its limits now. He becomes violent towards her. Once outside the house, he comes face to face with Fedka, a convicted criminal whom Pyotr has recruited to assist Nikolai, perhaps in getting rid of his wife Maria, to stop the scandal. Nikolai is in a very foul mood, so he first attacks Fedka and then insults him by throwing some money at him. Oh boy, this impulsive act wasn't wise. Nikolai later realizes that it was not wise to give the criminal money because by paying the convict, he has somehow implicated himself in a possible murder. It is possible Fedka assumes the money was a payment to murder Maria, Nikolai's wife. Pyotr has Nikolai completely wrapped, so he inches towards his revolution by targeting another influential person in town, the governor's wife, Julia. He uses his sexual seduction and masculine charm to control her. Pyotr and some of his comrades infiltrate Julia's private parties to talk about the ills of the system so that they mentally prepare the people for a revolution. The governor himself knows what's happening, but he has no power over his wife because she only listens to charming young Pyotr, who runs the town like a mafia boss. But he's still not there yet. He has a few other plans to fall into place before he can achieve his socialist revolution. He gathers everyone, including Nikolai and Shatov, to tell them about the violent overthrow of the government. While everyone agrees with him, Shatov and Nikolai leave the meeting to show their dissent. Pyotr is not happy, so he follows Nikolai, and his tactic to recruit him for revolution becomes bizarre and farcical. Pyotr confesses that he loves Nikolai and even kisses his hand. His blackmail didn't work, so he uses sexual charm. Dostoevsky depicts his atheist as somewhat pathetic. I don't know what sort of atheists were around in Russia in those days. Or perhaps Dostoevsky saw atheists as nothing but cartoonish people. Pyotr tickles Nikolai's ego by promising him the leadership position in the new revolutionary regime. Nobody can say no to power, of course. Nikolai remains silent, but we know he wants it. That devil wants power. Despite all his personal problems with women, he wants to be the leader. So far things have been calm, just ideas, conversations and gossip. Now Dostoevsky cranks it up a notch. Ideas turn to violence, only if you really believe in those ideas. People die for their beliefs, but also kill others for their beliefs. So ideas can liberate you, but also become your worst demons. Things begin to go south for the small Russian town. Julia, the governor's wife, has arranged a gala or ball in which all the influential people of the town are supposed to gather for some great food, drinks, conversation, and even poetry. But before the gala starts, we have some revolutionaries and workers gather outside the governor's house, and there's a mad chaos. Some madness as the governor loses his shit and starts acting like a lunatic. The man knows he has lost his wife and his powers. So we have a revolution. But remember, we also have a family drama here. Nikolai tells everyone that he is indeed married to Maria, the madwoman. Seeing this, people are a bit distracted from the actual revolution. Instead, everyone is interested in the gossip. There is a war going on in the world, but Will Smith did what? Dostoevsky shows that we humans are not as rational as we might think we are. At times we enjoy gossip more than actually worrying about revolutions or wars. We need gossip, stories and family dramas to calm our nerves. The gala takes place, and since we are in Russia, a few drunkards invade the stage and some other dramas. But the star of the show is a great writer, Karamazov. Dostoevsky uses his character to poke fun at Ivan Turgenev, who was more a westernized writer, more like a French artistic writer who reads a poem titled Merci if you thought he wasn't French enough. He annoys the hell out of everyone by spending a long time talking nonsense without getting to the point. This is pretty cheap of Dostoevsky if I'm being honest. He disliked Turgenev for his secularism. Sure, Dostoevsky can tell great psychological stories, but no Russian writer is as poetic as Turgenev when it comes to writing about nature and the countryside. The gala turns into a farce. People are drunk and Pyotr consoles Julia that everything is fine. Later that evening, the ball continues, but things start to go further south. Someone shouts fire and everyone panics. Julia, the hostess, faints and her husband, the governor, is knocked unconscious. The town is burning all night. There's also news that Maria and her brother have been murdered. Nikolai, our main hero, oblivious to all these events, is spending the night with the beautiful Lisa. At some point, there's a knock on the door. Pyotr is here to convey that Fedka, the convict whom Nikolai had thrown money at, has murdered both Maria and her brother. Lisa rushes to find out for herself. Nikolai tries to stop her, but the woman walks right into the chaos and gets herself killed in the process. Pyotr's revolution triumphs, but there's no time for celebration. Now it's time to take revenge. Most revolutions are acts of revenge, and this is no different. Pyotr and his comrades punish those who opposed him. He murders Ivan Shatov, a former socialist turned against revolution. He then finds his housemate Kirillov, and they have a titanic debate, which conveniently ends when Kirillov commits suicide. So the murder of Ivan Shatov can be blamed on Kirillov, who is dead and unable to defend himself. It's like an atomic bomb has exploded in town. Pyotr's father, Stepan, the teacher, the spiritual leader to the young man, flees the town on foot. But he's stricken by an illness and dies while regretting his life and asking God for forgiveness. He says, quote, "God is necessary to me, if only because he is the only being whom one can love eternally." This was Dostoevsky's main reason for the existence of God. We cannot love a human being forever because humans are flawed. Each generation wants to have a new human God. To solve this, Dostoevsky wanted a non-human God. There are a few more deaths, including a newborn child. Once the dust settles, many things come to light. A man confesses about the plot exposing the revolutionary circle. The authorities round the revolutionaries one by one, and one man is missing. Pyotr has left the town heading for St. Petersburg. The last shocking news in the novel is that Nikolai, who had abused many women, has committed suicide inside his state. He spent his entire life seeking more and more pleasures. Dostoevsky's biggest problem with the godless world was self-indulgence. He traveled the world, he slept with many women, he sought those things to numb the pain of his empty existence. But nothing quenched his thirst. His death finally put a stop to his suffering. His mother is distraught beyond belief. This all sounds like a terrible nightmare, but as history of Russia transpired, some 50 years after the publication of Demons, Russia woke up to the October revolutions of 1917 by Bolsheviks. The Romanovs were murdered soon after to establish the USSR, which ruled Russia for 70 years. Analysis. Nihilism. The main premise of the novel is this assumption that bad ideas possesses one's soul like demons do. Once it takes over, you begin to act like crazy. A good analogy would be rabies in dogs. The virus gets into their brain and controls them from the inside. There are two demons in the novel, nihilism and hedonism. On the one hand, we have atheism of Pyotr, whose revolution brings a lot of chaos in the fictional town. His character and his ideas are a bit farcical. His demon is his Western indoctrination or ideology to change Russia in order to bring equality by destroying the old system. It's much like the socialists that came after 1905 and 1917 revolutions. These Russian radicals were influenced by the German and French utopian socialism, who believed in creating a perfect society that runs like a clockwork where everyone is happy and equal. Dostoevsky joined a socialist circle as a young man, which resulted in his exile to Siberia. Here he looks back at those naive and youthful days when he was possessed with new shiny ideas without really knowing the consequence of their activities. I think the youth in every society has a desire for change, while the old try to resist change because they have seen it all through their life experiences. Dostoevsky as an older man looks back at his own youth. This nihilistic demon was also the main theme in Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, published 10 years before Dostoevsky's Demons. For me, Fathers and Sons is far more artistic in how the nihilist is transformed through his own encounters with the real world and his own experiences. Turgenev is much more methodical by highlighting the differences between hot-headed youth and the calm of the old people. The young are naive to the reality of the world, while the old are stuck in their assumptions and biases. But ultimately, in Turgenev's novel, the youth with their new sexy ideas lose against lifetime experience of the old, because they are more grounded in reality. So experience wins against ideas. Dostoevsky, in his usual messy Titanic style, bangs characters against each other, which is incredibly inciting and dramatic. Turgenev is like a violinist in a quiet countryside, while Dostoevsky is like a percussionist in the midst of urban hustle and bustle. Also, Dostoevsky's depiction of Karamazov, whom everyone considered to be Turgenev, is not justified for me. As a conservative man, Dostoevsky disliked Turgenev for his liberal European outlook, which is fair enough, but he depicts Turgenev as a rambly and confusing, which is completely the opposite of the real Turgenev. Reading Turgenev's novels, which are very short compared to Dostoevsky's long, winding novels, they are incredibly to the point. Turgenev's stories are far more poetic and beautiful due to his French influence, I think, but they lack the excitement and drama of Dostoevsky's storytelling. Turgenev's nihilist character in Father and Son, Bazarov, is a far more rounded character than Dostoevsky's Pyotr, who is almost cartoonish at times in how rigid he is in his ideas. I think Turgenev is a more objective writer compared to Dostoevsky, who was a conservative Russian, disliked most things that came from the West. Did Turgenev and later Dostoevsky foresee the Russian Revolution? Russia in 1860s was a chaotic place, as 30 million serfs were suddenly freed, so they flooded the cities for opportunities. Obviously, Moscow and St. Petersburg couldn't absorb everyone, so poverty, homelessness, prostitution, etc. led to a lot of chaos. The serfs in the country used to be controlled by the landowners. Now they were free but also hungry for change. Turgenev's Father and Sons came out a year after the emancipation of serfs, so he set the story in the countryside. Dostoevsky's Demons came out 10 years after the emancipation of serfs, so most cities were flooded with the poor, which the radical intellectuals saw as a reason to revolt against the monarchy. A lot of Dostoevsky's characters are based on real people who were active in the 1860s. Russia's highly unequal and volatile socio-economic infrastructure on the one hand and its highly communitarian values on the other provided the ideal conditions for socialism to grow and ultimately overthrow the Tsarist system. Dostoevsky also saw a connection between utopian socialism and Christianity, especially in the character of Kirillov, who wants to sacrifice himself for the greater good to become a Jesus-like figure. Now we see the connection between socialism and Christianity more clearly, as they both promise a future utopia, one on earth, the other on the afterlife. Here Dostoevsky questions revolution as a means of achieving that which is violent. He was against violence in any form. As a small man myself, I understand Dostoevsky's concern about violence. Dostoevsky understood that once you stick to your idea or ideology or tribe, then violence against those outside your circle, tribe, ideology becomes an easy act for you, because you have a goal and anything that stands in front of you needs to be removed. The old adage, the end justifies the means. Hedonism. The second demon Dostoevsky is talking about is more psychological. Nikolai symbolizes a kind of self-indulgence, hedonism, a thirst for sex, power, and pleasure. If Pyotr was possessed by utopian social justice demons, Nikolai was possessed by his carnal desire of sleeping with women, seeking quick gratification in life. His demon is his own body. Pyotr was possessed in the head, while Nikolai was possessed in the body, mainly in his penis area, I guess. But he's also possessed in his desire for power. Despite not being convinced by Pyotr's revolutionary or utopian ideas, Nikolai hopes the revolution puts him at the helm, so he can fulfill his desire for power. And who knows, more women too. The central question Dostoevsky is asking is this: if modernity liberated people from God, religion, and traditions, has it replaced those things with something meaningful? His answer is no. Since modernity killed God, people feel more and more empty on the inside. Once something is empty, it is very easy to fill it with something cheap, instantaneous, and temporary. You either fall into the hands of shiny ideologies like idealism, rationalism, materialism, atheism, socialism, and so forth. If ideas are not your thing, you fill your void with shopping, sex, addiction, endless travels, or social media. But unfortunately, all those things are only temporary. So in the long run, nothing can quench your thirst or fill the void. Final words. The novel reads partly like a political drama and partly comedy. The botched revolution is more like a farcical revolution performed on stage. I think Dostoevsky is serious, but also not serious. He poses his usual questions about atheism, religion, meaning, and irrationality of humans. Despite being psychological, the political tone and the setting of the novel make it less serious. In this novel, Dostoevsky is in his most Gogol-style comedy. Pyotr is cartoonishly square in his socialist ideology. The most complicated character is of course his father Stepan, whose intellectual life is a bag of contradictions. He lives with this woman yet has no romantic relationships. He has revolutionary ideas but condemns revolution. He's an atheist who turns to God. I think as humans we go through many stages in life. When young we have radical tendencies, want change, question traditions and the system. As we grow older, we establish ourselves through our jobs, family, children, and material success. We tend to become more conservative and want to keep traditions. Dostoevsky depicts his own experience of radical youth versus his experienced old age. In this novel, he reflects on that. Perhaps the most psychologically complex character is Nikolai, whose existence is perhaps the most mysterious and the most horrifying too. He is possessed by his own inner demons of sex, deception, and power. He doesn't have any deep principles. He's not a black and white character but varying shades of grey, perhaps 50 shades when it comes to his entanglement with endless women. Dostoevsky shows the complexity of human existence. We want progress but often very quickly without really thinking about the consequences. Human history is littered with violence in the forms of revolutions, conquests, wars, and often due to the whims of some ill-advised individuals, whose grasp of reality is quite superficial. Each generation wants different things. The young want to change society, the old want to keep the traditions going. Perhaps there should be a balance there. Without new ideas, societies stagnate, and without traditions, societies fall apart. Dostoevsky warned young people to think twice before starting a revolution. Listen to those older than yourself because they experienced life longer. Don't be too stuck in your own ideas. But Dostoevsky also shows how the old are stuck in their assumptions and biases, which blind them to see the value of change sometimes. So this old generational conflict is almost guaranteed to continue for the rest of human existence. But the best way to feel and experience each generation's perspective and to comprehensively understand the other can be done best through reading great literature. Fyodor Dostoevsky's short story Son Smeshnaya Chalaveka, translated into English as The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, tells the story of a lonely and despairing man who has nothing to live for. So he's on the verge of ending it all when something incredible happens. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man was published in 1877, towards the end of Dostoevsky's own life, 2 years before he published his greatest novel, The Brothers Karamazov, and 4 years before his own death in 1881. So this short story came at a time when Dostoevsky had experienced life from the lowest of the low to the highest. As usual, I'll tell you the story, discuss its themes, and how it can teach us about the purpose of life. This is perhaps one of the most uplifting stories you will ever hear. So stay tuned until the very end when everything is revealed that might bring tears to your eyes. Summary. We are in St. Petersburg, Russia. We meet a man on the streets of the capital who narrates his own story thus: I'm a ridiculous man, now they call me a madman. The tale begins in the same way as Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky's other most famous existentialist tale. The man says that he has always been a ridiculous man at school, at university, and throughout his youth. But you know what? He has always resented this title and never had the courage to confess to being a ridiculous man. But then, as a grown man, he comes to the realization that nothing really matters in this world. He feels it doesn't matter if the world existed before or it would exist in the future. This sudden realization brings a huge feeling of relief and liberation in him. He's no longer burdened to carry the weight of his existence over his shoulders, so suddenly he's eased off his suffering. But this realization has not turned our hero into a Taoist who wants to flow with nature, but this realization has turned him into a nihilist who sees life without any value or meaning. Yes, there is no purpose in life. Everything is meaningless. He's not only indifferent to the world, but he has made up his mind that his life is no longer worth living. It's just a matter of time he would end it all. One night, as he wanders the street, the man is carrying a pistol, intent on ending his empty life. The streets are dark except for some lamps. The man looks up the sky. Something catches his eyes. He notices a star all alone, just like him. He sees his own existence as a lonesome star wandering in this empty universe. What is the point? Why is he walking the semi-dark streets of St. Petersburg and up in the sky this tiny star all alone? Why? But as he's watching the star, something extraordinary happens on the ground. A little girl of about 8 grabs his elbow. Her clothes are tattered and soaked in the rain, her shoes broken, and she's crying the word "Mummy." Quote, I turned facing her. I did not say a word and went on, but she ran, pulling at me, and there was that note in her voice which in frightened children means despair. I know that sound. Though she did not articulate the words, I understood that her mother was dying and that something of the sort was happening to them, and that she had run out to call someone, to find something to help her mother. I did not go with her. On the contrary, I had an impulse to drive her away. I told her first to go to the policeman. But clasping her hands, she ran beside me, sobbing and gasping. It would not leave me. Then I stamped my foot and shouted at her. She called out, "Sir, sir," but suddenly abandoned me and rushed headlong across the road. Some other passerby appeared there, and she evidently flew from me to him. Despite him pushing away the little girl, our hero is shaken by the experience. He returns to his soulless apartment, but something like a struggle has crept inside him. He was intent on shooting himself, but now he feels an inner pain. The encounter with the little girl has brought something inside him. A flame, an idea, a nudge, but he doesn't fully understand what it is. It is something. Despite this slight shift inside him, he still wants to end his life that same night. As he's pondering these ideas, he suddenly falls asleep. He dreams that he has gone through his plan and has shot himself. He's dead. Yes, it's all over. People hold a funeral and bury him beneath the ground inside a tiny grave. He feels no pain. If anything, the only feeling he has is loneliness and cold. Then, as rainwater seeps into his grave, he feels an utter despair and shouts these words. Whoever you may be, if you exist, and if anything more rational than what is happening here is possible, suffer it to be here now. But if you are revenging yourself upon me for my senseless suicide, for the hideousness and the absurdity of this subsequent existence, then let me tell you that no torture could ever equal the contempt which I shall go on dumbly feeling, though my martyrdom may last 1,000,000 years. Suddenly a dark figure opens his grave and pulls him out. The shadowy figure grabs him, and together they fly up the sky and eventually into the empty space. He feels nothing but thrill and ecstasy as they soar up. Then he notices the lonely star he saw from below a few hours earlier. It turns out near that lonely star there's a lonely little planet just like Earth. Just then he suddenly thinks about the suffering child he saw on the street of St. Petersburg and wonders if this planet also has suffering kids. Dostoevsky grappled with the idea of suffering kids throughout his novels, and in his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, he made kids his main focus. For Dostoevsky, suffering kids was the biggest dilemma of human existence and religious belief. If God truly existed, then why would he make innocent children suffer? He never found a satisfactory answer. Now back to the story. Our hero is flying in space towards the little planet by the lonely star with this strange figure. When he arrives at the planet, he realizes that everything is just like Earth with one exception. Here on this planet, people accept their fate. They accept death. In other words, they embrace what happens to them with open arms. As a result of having this carefree attitude towards death, people are incredibly happy and courageous. The universal principle on this planet is love. Love people no matter who they are. Love people despite their shortcomings. Love people despite their darkness. The people also love our narrator despite knowing the darkness in his heart and despite him being a stranger. They accept him without a single question. But here's a twist in the tale. Our hero from Earth still has his earthly habits. He introduces something we humans do every day: deception. We lie. Old habits creep in. One day he accidentally teaches the people to lie. We all know what happens next. Soon the blissful planet is turned into another Earth. Instead of pursuing peace and happiness, they pursue knowledge and power. Instead of cultivating love, they develop science and technology. Instead of the collective, they promote individualism and selfishness. Soon there's chaos, wars, divisions, and tribalism. People, instead of being happy or promoting well-being, they study happiness and they study well-being like scientists. In other words, instead of being happy, they want to become happy, just like our world today. Our hero tries his best to persuade people to return to their old ways of blissful life, but everyone laughs at him and calls him insane. At the height of his despair, he suddenly wakes up from his St. Petersburg dream and realizes that it's still in his room. He also notices his pistol next to him, but the dream has been so incredibly transformative for our hero that the Chekhovian gun no longer fires. For the very first time in his life, our narrator understands how incredible it is to be alive, how immensely powerful life is, how lucky he is to be alive. It's 1 in a million or billion chance that he is alive. He decides to live a full life and teach people to love one another. He firmly believes that the planet Earth is our true paradise. Instead of seeking another planet, it's here we make a paradise for everyone. What happens to the little girl? Well, I'll tell you at the end. Themes. Instead of intellectuals, Dostoevsky championed ordinary people as a source of true existentialist wisdom. Why? Because intellectuals tend to intellectualize life, while ordinary people live life. This theme of living life, not questioning things, was first elaborated by Cervantes and Don Quixote, but later Dostoevsky took it as his foundational philosophy of existence. Life is not about pursuing knowledge and power, but living your life to the fullest while simultaneously loving others. In other words, today we're bogged down by tribal bickering and political pettiness, which ultimately makes us unhappy. We don't understand the truth about ourselves because we're too focused on judging and worrying about others. Instead of enjoying and loving life, we focus on other people's lives. The ridiculous man's dream opened a door into his subconscious self, like some gateway to his deeper existence or higher consciousness. When we focus on others, we keep that door shut. Today, loneliness is a real thing. To escape it, we fake things on social media for temporary validation. Michel de Montaigne, whom I have discovered recently thanks to Grace on YouTube, argues that solitude gives us mental clarity as well as moral integrity. As a result, we don't rush making snap judgments, decisions, or mistakes. Seeking other people's attention or validation can sway us in some unsavory ways, turn us into mobs or foot soldiers of some political or tribal groups. In other words, being among the crowd or seeking their validation can blind us to see our true purpose. Since we live in an attention-seeking existence, Dostoevsky shows us how we tend to see the glass half empty. Life's problems can also be opportunities for change. The ridiculous man noticed the star among the foggy lights of St. Petersburg. Later, his dream allowed him to examine things with clarity and precision. It's incredible that sometimes a simple idea or inspiration can turn us from the depth of despair to the height of vitality. Just a simple nudge. This shows how fragile the human mind is. You can cure the deepest of problems with the smallest of change. Just like changing a lens on a camera, suddenly everything focuses, there's clarity, and suddenly you're revitalized. Dostoevsky shows that to live a full life, all you need is a simple mind, a clear mind, a simple purpose. Dostoevsky's psychological depth at the time when psychology as we know it didn't exist is almost incredible. The subconscious wasn't seen as something serious. Everything sort of revolved either in the arena of religious belief or the material world. Dostoevsky understood that humans were ruled by things other than the material side of life. There was something deeper which we call the existential angst today. At the time and even today, most people believe if your material life is sorted, i.e. a good house and lots of money in the bank, you will be happy. Dostoevsky understood that that's rarely the case. Modernity has been incredibly successful in alleviating poverty and diseases, but it has failed to provide us with the mental clarity or a higher purpose. In the absence of clear purpose, Dostoevsky saw a clear nihilistic tendency early on. Despite the material comfort, a lot of people are not happy because they lack mental clarity or a sense of direction or an anchor. Dostoevsky's message in The Dream of Ridiculous Man is that the purpose of our existence is to love life, but also love and care for others. Once you fully understand this, it's unbelievably liberating and cathartic. The ridiculous man's encounter with the little girl seeking help was enough to nudge him in the right direction. Now he has a purpose. Suddenly a man's protector or provider's instinct kicks in and you have a man transformed. The desire to provide and protect is incredibly strong in men that they can sacrifice so much in order to protect and provide for their family. Dostoevsky in all his novels captured the spirit of a lonely man who is lost for purpose in life, men who had nothing to live for, and the cure Dostoevsky saw was women and children who have an immense power to restore broken men. In Crime and Punishment, it was Sonia who ultimately saved Raskolnikov. The little girl's despair ignited a flame inside the ridiculous man. Throughout history, the biggest purpose a man could have was to protect his wife and children. When you're no longer able to have a family, you have pretty much nothing to live for. But our ridiculous man has found a purpose. At the end of the story, there's this incredible happy ending. The ridiculous man has some great news. Quote, "And I tracked out that little girl, and I shall go on and on." The Brothers Karamazov is considered one of the greatest and most profound Russian novels of all time. But what is the story and why it's important? What are the three main philosophies discussed? What was Dostoevsky's purpose in writing it? And what are some of its weaknesses? And finally, what is it really about? This is a summary and analysis of The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Often called his magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's last novel, published 1 year before his death in 1881, but it's also his longest novel, almost twice the length of his other famous novel, Crime and Punishment, which I have already summarized here. First, I'll give you a full summary and then give you a few points of analysis, mainly the three major philosophies that run through the novel. At the end, I'll tell you Dostoevsky's main purpose in writing this novel, which might surprise you. Summary. First, let me tell you that the plot of The Brothers Karamazov is a murder, in which the father is killed, but we don't know which son has killed him. But that's the surface level story. It goes much deeper into religion, philosophy, and psychology. These are a staple of Dostoevsky's themes. Before I go any further, let's meet the Karamazov family. Perhaps the most dysfunctional family in Russia. The father is Fyodor Karamazov, who has 3 kids from 2 marriages. He's also got an illegitimate 4th son who also plays a major role in the plot. Fyodor Karamazov is not the best father in Russia. He prefers to enjoy life instead of taking care of his kids. His philosophy is that life is short, you might as well enjoy it. As a result of this hands-off approach to raising kids, he has 3 very different sons with very contrasting worldviews and personalities. The eldest is Dmitri, who's most similar to his father. He loves alcohol and women, so when he grows up, he demands his father for his share of the family's wealth, so he can get married. This father-son conflict starts off the whole drama of this novel. The second son, Ivan, is an intellectual who questions why there is so much suffering in this world. So he concludes that the Almighty doesn't exist, otherwise he would not allow so much suffering. Or this God is not good and compassionate that allows innocent children dying. Ivan is perhaps the young Dostoevsky himself, who was drawn to atheism and Western ideas at the time. His third son and the youngest, Alyosha, is the protagonist of the novel. He's a good-hearted religious boy who spends a lot of time in a church with an old priest called Father Zosima. Fyodor Karamazov, the father, also has a 4th son out of wedlock, Pavel Smerdyakov, who is employed as a servant in the family. He is not considered very bright, so he gets easily influenced by the atheist Ivan. So the father and his 4 sons are the main family in the novel. I wonder why Dostoevsky didn't give Karamazov a daughter. Perhaps with a female presence, they might have been less dysfunctional, therefore less interesting as a story. There are so many characters in the novel, but the father and his 3 legitimate sons and 1 bastard son are the main characters in the story. Father Zosima is a priest who counterbalances Ivan's atheism and also a mentor to Alyosha, the youngest Karamazov. The 2 main female characters are 2 young women, Grusha and Katya, who are romantically involved with Dmitri, the eldest Karamazov. At the end of the novel, both women turn somewhat religious thanks to the works by Alyosha. The main plot of the novel revolves around money, specifically family inheritance. The eldest son Dmitri demands his share of the family money so he can get married to his fiancée, but his father, Fyodor, refuses. Why? It turns out the father and his son Dmitri love the same woman, Grusha. Grusha on her part plays the two men against each other and enjoys watching them tear each other apart. It turns out Grusha was hurt by some other men, so this is her revenge on men. But she also gets jealous as Dmitri gets engaged to Katya, another prominent female character in the novel. Then we have a few long detours in the novel in which Dostoevsky tells us separate stories. In fact, Dostoevsky wrote these stories in different periods in his life and then patched them together here. Why? Because he knew it would be his final novel before his death a year later. The first of these subplot stories is a little boy, Ilyusha, not to be confused with the main character, Alyosha. Ilyusha is bullied by his peers and later dies of humiliation caused by Dmitry Karamazov attacking the little boy's father. I'll tell you later why childhood is perhaps the most important theme in the novel. Another major subplot is the story of a Spanish inquisitor who is visited by Jesus to tell him to curb his brutality against non-Christians. As you know, in the 15th century, during the Inquisition in Europe, thousands of Jews and Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity, and those who refused were burned alive or killed in horrific ways. So Dostoevsky tries to answer whether force is justified in putting people in line. So here Jesus returns to tell the Grand Inquisitor that his actions are not justified. You cannot kill or torture people to make them Christian. But the Grand Inquisitor turns the table and imprisons Jesus to teach him that Jesus is too idealistic and has no understanding of human nature. He tells Jesus that force is needed to turn humans into good humans. If left to their own device, as in free will, humans turn nasty. I guess this might be due to Dostoevsky reading Darwin, that humans are basically beasts and it was society, mainly religion, that civilized them. Without force, they cannot find the right path, so free will is not the answer, but social force is necessary to make people become good. This story is told to Alyosha, but it's meant to teach Ivan, the atheist, that rationality cannot beat love. Jesus represents love, and Grand Inquisitor is the symbol of rational thinking. Love triumphs over science and reason, so to speak. A third subplot is the story of Father Zosima, who was a young rebel but was saved by his Christian faith. Later in the novel, when he dies, his followers expect his body not to decay due to his religious piety, but soon the smell is so terrible that shakes everyone's faith in his holiness, but also religious faith as a whole. Nobody is more devastated than his protege, Alyosha, the young Karamazov. But then he meets Grusha, Dmitri's romantic interest, who restores his faith. A little female touch, I suppose, helps Alyosha to continue in spreading his message of love. Nothing sexual, but a more religious connection. This is the same in Crime and Punishment when Raskolnikov meets Sonia. He feels unburdened and ultimately agrees to confess his crime. I think Dostoevsky believed that women in general heal troubled men. So now we know that Karamazov family was dysfunctional precisely because there was no female presence in the family. Now let's return to the main plot. Dmitri is tired of dealing with his father and decides to run away with his lover Grusha, but she has disappeared. Here Dmitri panics, thinking that she might have chosen his father as a lover instead. Why? The father has all the money while Dmitri is broke. Dmitri goes to his father's house with a pestle as a weapon to attack his father. Dostoevsky here plays a trick where the story suddenly stopped. So the next time we see Dmitri, he attacks a servant who tries to stop him from fleeing the house. The servant also accuses him of killing his father, Fyodor Karamazov. Soon the police arrest Dmitri and charges him for the murder of his own father. What is the evidence? A witness seeing him flee the house and a pestle as a weapon. But the damning evidence is that a lot of money is missing and Dmitri suddenly has a huge stack of cash with him. He tries to explain that this money belongs to his fiancée, but the police are not convinced. Meanwhile, Alyosha, the youngest Karamazov, continues to spread his goodness and love. He meets Kolya, a young boy who is westernized and radicalized without really understanding these Western philosophies like atheism, socialism, and nihilism. On the other hand, we have the atheist Ivan, who is depicted as having a negative influence on those around him. One person in particular, Pavel Smerdyakov, his bastard brother, who confesses to Ivan that he actually killed his father and stole the money. So Dmitri is innocent. Ivan asks Smerdyakov why kill his father. He says because earlier Ivan had told him that in the absence of God, anything was permissible. So in a sense, Ivan is also implicated in the murder of his own father. Here we see Ivan turning into Raskolnikov, terrorized by his own demons, delirium, and insanity. Because deep down he knows he's responsible for the murder too by influencing Smerdyakov that there was no God and any act was permissible. Later, Ivan learns that Pavel Smerdyakov has committed suicide, which relieves him that now he cannot be implicated in the murder. Dmitri is tried and found guilty in court. The whole trial exposes the nastiness and resentment of those involved. Dostoevsky shows how irrational human beings really are when it comes to justice system. It's not about justice, but revenge. The justice system is also corrupt because it sends Dmitri, an innocent man, to prison. Dmitri is sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in, you guessed it, Siberia. Siberia is a place where bad people are corrected in Russia. Good people stay in the city and bad people are sent to the cold. If you do something bad in Russia, just be prepared to live in the cold of Siberia for a few years. Dmitri has a plan to escape to America and then years later return to Russia under a different name. But we don't know if he manages to do that or not. Alyosha still continues to spread his religious love, mostly among young boys. Ivan the atheist goes mad and is taken to a hospital. So to conclude the Brothers Karamazov, the father, Fyodor Karamazov, the rich pleasure seeker, is murdered. His eldest son, Dmitri, also a pleasure seeker, is found guilty despite the fact that he is innocent. Here Dostoevsky shows that we suffer no matter whether we are guilty or not because life is suffering. Poor people around the world live in terrible conditions, not of their own fault. His second son, Ivan, the rational atheist, goes insane. Irony there. His bastard son, Pavel, the real murderer, commits suicide. For Dostoevsky, the guilty brother is Ivan, the atheist, as it was he who influenced Pavel that anything is permissible, including murder. His youngest son, the protagonist of the novel, Alyosha, continues to spread religious message of love. Dostoevsky wanted to show him as his ideal reader, as he's young and somewhat innocent and naive, as he watches different ideologies and outlooks collide so they can learn how to live his life, which is to love everyone, no matter if you're guilty or innocent, poor or rich, bad or good. At the end of the novel, the young kids who bullied a child attend the funeral of the young victim to show remorse. This shows that no matter how small an action of bullying or even insulting words can have huge consequences in someone's life. One must take responsibility for their actions, no matter how trivial it may seem. Analysis. The writing is very fluent, conversational and improvised, but also messy, perhaps telling us that Dostoevsky had a cluttered mind with many philosophies and ideas in some titanic battle inside his head. You don't want to be in Dostoevsky's head. Dostoevsky shows his love for the ordinary people here. Dmitri, despite chasing women, money and alcohol, has an honesty that Dostoevsky admires. He finds the intellectual Ivan secretive, dishonest and coward. Today we see those negative traits in bankers, politicians, clever people who play the system so well that they never get caught, and usually the ordinary people who pay the price for the actions of those smart but selfish people. Dmitri gets sent to jail, not Ivan, who masterminds the whole thing. So usually the innocent pays the price. I think for Dostoevsky, reason and rational thinking doesn't make your life easier. Psychologically speaking, of course. Materially speaking, rationality makes life easier by inventing tools and techniques for an easier life. But when it comes to psychological happiness, Dostoevsky prefers less rationality but more naivety. Why? Guilt only comes when you knowingly do something. Intelligence makes your life more complicated, and smart people are less happy than those who are naive. It is simplistic to say that Dostoevsky agrees that ignorance is bliss, but he definitely thinks knowing too much makes your life harder. This runs in his other novels too, most clearly in The Idiot. Dostoevsky famously said that consciousness was a disease. So according to Dostoevsky, we should curb our intelligence, curb our knowledge, and have faith and trust in people in the world around us. Don't question everything. Philosophies. Three main philosophies are present in the novel. First, on the left we have Ivan, who is an atheist and represents Western Enlightenment philosophy of rationalism. He believes that everything should be scientifically proven before he can trust it. His main question is why there is so much suffering in the world, especially innocent children dying. Either God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he is not a good God to allow so much pain. Dostoevsky, by depicting Ivan going insane at the end of the novel, believes rationalism ultimately leads to nihilism. Around the same time, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, had the same conclusion. But Nietzsche offers art as an answer to the problem of nihilism. Dostoevsky has love as an antidote. The second philosophy is hedonism, which is a middle ground for Dostoevsky. We have Fyodor the father and Dmitri. Both represent a more hedonistic philosophy of life, where the focus is more on pleasures of life. That life is short, you have to enjoy it. But this also brings a violence in the mix, as you are less careful and less responsible. Romanticism in Europe grew in response to Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment philosophy of rationalism. They focused on the emotions and passions, which is creative but also can be volatile and even violently destructive. And finally, the third philosophy is the religious faith on the right, as we have Alyosha and Father Zosima who believe in religious faith. A bit dogmatic, but also they believe in love as the only way to treat others. Dostoevsky leans towards religion here. He was on his deathbed, so it was perhaps his way of redeeming himself. Somewhat similar to George Orwell, who also turned religious at the end of his life, which I discussed in my video 10 Lessons from Orwell. Having said that, Dostoevsky also questioned religious absolutism, so there are many scenes where religious faith as dogma is robustly questioned. The most famous scene is Father Zosima's body putrefying, much to the dismay of his followers. So Dostoevsky didn't believe in saints nor in pure evil. He thought every human being was capable of both, and one has to constantly battle to keep the balance. Both on the left and right, human idealism is the main theme. Atheism and religious faith are human idealized views, thus less practical. In the middle, you have the more animalistic pleasure-seeking people who don't fight their carnal desires. For Dostoevsky, idealism is not the answer, but being responsible towards fellow human beings matters the most. The responsibility to act well. In a way, Dostoevsky promotes naivety or innocence and love for everyone. Weaknesses. My biggest criticism is that Brothers Karamazov is not focused enough. There are too many subplots, so this can make the reading a bit tough for today's readers. If you condense the main story, you would probably get about 500 pages, not the current 1000 pages. As I said, several of the stories were written years earlier and he patched them together as he knew it would be his last novel. He died a year after its publication. In the same way, 266 by Roberto Bolaño puts 5 novels into one. Another thing that most people miss is that Dostoevsky wrote this as a childhood novel, which is not clearly elaborated until the very end, so this can make those early childhood sections a bit tedious to read. Another weakness might be its religious tone for those who are not religious. If you are a Christian reader, you might enjoy, but readers who are not religious may find the Grand Inquisitor section a bit tedious. Having said that, the novel is very deep and nuanced, and the plot very intriguing. Another big pain in the butt is Russian names. This is not only in Brothers Karamazov, but in all old Russian novels. Each character has like 4 to 8 different names depending on who is calling them. For example, Alyosha, whose name is Alexei, is called Alyoshka, Alyoshenka, Alyoshchka, Alyoshchik, Lyosha, and Lyoshenka. The more names a character has, the more important they are in the novel. Alyosha has 8, Dmitri 5, and Ivan 4. Final words. The ultimate message of the Brothers Karamazov is this. It is better to be naive or even stupid, but good, than smart, successful, but bad. In a way, Dostoevsky didn't like how capitalism focused on ruthlessness and material success was ruining the innocence that permeated in the simple lives of the Russian peasants. Now, as promised at the beginning of this video, I'll answer what the Brothers Karamazov is really about. In this final novel, Dostoevsky was looking back at his own childhood, the innocence of 1820s, 200 years ago from today, away from the messy world of adulthood, Western ideas, and Siberian experience, gambling, and tons of other shitty things that grown-ups get involved in. Dostoevsky knew he was dying soon, so he wanted to tell other Russians that life is too short to do stupid revolutionary ideas to tear each other apart for money. A simple life is all you need. He wanted to take Russians to those good old days of simplicity and naivety. So The Brothers Karamazov is a novel of childhood, and Dostoevsky wrote it to preserve the childhood innocence that we lose when we grow up and learn the sinister world of adulthood, and we spend the rest of our lives to restore that childhood naivety but never manage. In other words, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That's it. So Dostoevsky tells us not to see everything, not to question everyone. Blind trust can cause suffering, but it's good in the long term. In a way, it's similar to Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, in which Proust went back to his magical world of his childhood wonders, to recapture the lost time, the magic of not knowing the cynicism of this world, the magic of simplicity. So The Brothers Karamazov is a novel about the magic of childhood. Nietzsche says God the father figure is dead. Dostoevsky shows what happens when God dies. Children go crazy, there are murders, chaos, nihilistic meaninglessness, and deep suffering. How do you cure nihilism? Dostoevsky wants to revive the dead God back to life. Why? We cannot love a human being forever because humans are fundamentally flawed. We need a non-human, neutral God to unite different generations and different cultures. No human being can unite everyone. Nietzsche, however, takes us back to our evolutionary past, back to the wild west of natural creativity. Why? Because it's in nature we can find new gods. We have become too human, too contaminated with religion, morality, and slave mentality. So we need a fresh start, going thousands of years back to find new human titans or geniuses. Nietzsche's Übermensch is the kind of humans who have overcome their human qualities. Dostoevsky says we need to cultivate goodness among people, while Nietzsche says forget about goodness, we need to cultivate greatness to flourish human culture. But what's interesting is that both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky looked for an answer not on the outside but inside the human subconscious mind and in human passion. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. Fyodor Dostoevsky is one of the greatest novelists of all time. He was the pioneer of psychological realism, a literary movement that probed into the human psyche to analyze what's going on inside our head to understand our deeper motivations behind the choices we make in life. What makes us tick, what makes us suffer, what makes us do terrible things, and finally, what makes us do good things. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the greatest philosophers of all time. He was the first philosopher to robustly question the entire Western philosophical foundation. Too much rationality and not enough passion. For Nietzsche, we are not driven by reason to do great things, but it's our natural passion that motivates us to create great things. A fierce critic of religion, Nietzsche saw artistic creativity the ultimate goal of human existence. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche diagnosed how modern, reason-driven enlightenment, instead of liberating us to reach our true potentials, was creating a new kind of nihilistic man who was self-centered, egotistic, and self-indulgent. They both rejected the humanists' claim that since humans are rational, we can create a free and happy and rational utopia. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche understood that humans are also quite irrational, passionate creatures always seeking meaning and purpose. Despite diagnosing the problem of modernity, they offered quite different solutions. Dostoevsky looked up to the sky for a non-human solution, i.e. God, and deep inside a human heart for universal love, while Nietzsche offered a nature-based, evolutionary solution. So in this video, I'll look at their lives, careers, writings, and philosophies. Who offers a better solution to the problem of nihilism? Is it possible that they complement each other? Who is the masculine father and who is the feminine mother among the two? But first, let me answer how their background shaped their views. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in 1821 in the suburb of Moscow into a middle-class family. Dostoevsky's father was a doctor who worked among the Russian poor, so Dostoevsky saw human pain and suffering firsthand, and almost every day, which became a central theme in all his novels. Friedrich Nietzsche was born some 22 years later after Dostoevsky in 1844 in the suburb of Leipzig. His father was the village priest, so Nietzsche also came across a lot of human pain and suffering due to his father's job. Perhaps Dostoevsky witnessed more physical pain, while Nietzsche witnessed more existential religious pain. Dostoevsky's father wanted him to learn hard sciences like medicine and engineering. But his mother and nanny read him a wide range of stories, so he came across narrative works by Pushkin, Cervantes, Goethe, and more. But Nikolai Gogol's satirical and dark comic tales had a huge impression on him, which he later emulated in his own fiction. Nietzsche, on the other hand, was surrounded by priests, something that ran in his family for generations. But his father died when he was around 5, so he was raised by his grandma, aunties, and mother. So he grew up without a strong male role model in the family. In other words, he experienced the death of a male authority and a priestly guide within his own family, which later he articulated that God was dead and humanity was without a chaperone. This mirrored his own life, growing up without a disciplinarian in his family. When Dostoevsky was 12, his parents borrowed money to send him to an expensive French boarding school for the filthy rich, where the little Fyodor found himself an outsider among the aristocrats who came from country states. The aristocrats in Russia were educated in French and they acted like French too, snotty-nosed snobs. This continued when Dostoevsky entered a military engineering academy in St. Petersburg, where he showed little interest in engineering and again found himself alone among his snobbish classmates. He saw the social inequality and how the upper class looked down on him and the Russian poor. This led Dostoevsky to write about the poor, but most crucially, he joined a radical group with the aim of changing Russia into a more egalitarian society. He joined a socialist circle called the Petrushevsky Circle. Meanwhile, in Germany, Nietzsche attended a boys' school, then a private school, and later a very prestigious Christian school. And not surprisingly, he excelled in theology, which was a family business after all. While there, Nietzsche studied music and literature, so he began composing songs and writing poems. But he was also introduced to many languages like Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and French, which resulted in him studying philology and theology in Bonn University later on. His goal was to become a priest like his father. But here's an interesting twist. He came across Ludwig Feuerbach's influential book, Essence of Christianity, in which the German anthropologist argued that God didn't create humans, but quite the opposite. Humans created God. This had a profound influence on Nietzsche as he abandoned theology and solely focused on philology, the study of languages. Suddenly, Nietzsche was an atheist and God was truly dead to him. What's even more interesting is that Dostoevsky's group, the Petrushevsky Circle, was founded 5 years after Feuerbach's influential book was published. So Feuerbach's atheism also trickled down to Russia to influence Dostoevsky's circle of friends. In 1845, Dostoevsky published his first major novel, Poor Folk, highlighting the class disparity in Russia. It was a big hit, but with the success, he was also flagged to the government. In 1849, he was arrested for his activities against the Russian state. He was put on a mock execution and then sent to Siberian labor camp for 4 years, and then another 6 years of compulsory military service to a total of 10 years of exile. In Siberia, he came across ordinary inmates who kept their spirits high despite the torrid conditions, because of their religious belief and also their admittance of guilt. The radical intellectuals, however, never took responsibility for their actions. Instead, they blamed everything on the state or other people. The socialist intellectuals usually blamed the upper classes as parasites, state as brutal, and the peasants as stupid for not standing up for their rights. In other words, the intellectuals were blameless. Nothing was their fault. This had a profound impact on Dostoevsky, and he became deeply disillusioned not only with the intellectuals, but also with Western ideas. He moved more and more towards Orthodox religion and the Russian communitarian way of life. He understood that Western rationality promised freedom, wealth, happiness, and fulfillment, but delivered some freedom, some wealth, but little happiness and even less fulfillment. Nietzsche had a far easier life, so to prove a point in 1867, his enthusiasm got the better of him as he volunteered to join the Prussian army. But he fell from his horse, broke a lot of bones, and then returned to his studies. That wasn't fun. Reading Schopenhauer is a lot easier than riding horses with a huge gun on your shoulder. In 1869, against all odds, he became a university professor in Basel, Switzerland at the age of 24. And incredibly, he hadn't even completed his doctorate degree. When you get lucky, you get lucky. Or he knew the right person, but there was no doubt he was a genius. He renounced his Prussian citizenship before heading to Switzerland. Nietzsche remained a stateless person until his death. Back then, people didn't carry passports, so it was easy to slide through borders. Nietzsche traveled a lot, partly due to his ill health, as he was seeking a better climate, but partly because he needed to be on the move so he could think. Nietzsche was one of those philosophers who thought with their feet. He would articulate his thoughts and even write some of his books while walking. I think his bipedal thought process is quite crucial because his philosophy is grounded in evolution in the human body, not in some divine power. In other words, the human body was the center of Nietzsche's philosophy. The ability to walk straight had a massive impact on our evolution as well as our brain. So thinking with your feet is a genuinely creative process in human evolution. Nietzsche wasn't a conventional behind-the-desk or armchair philosopher. He was a free-moving thinker, perhaps the most un-German German philosopher, and that makes him even more appealing to a wider audience. Most of his books read like a collection of sayings, aphorisms, poems, and short tales, not some organized philosophical treatise of complex structure. After 10 years in Siberia, Dostoevsky returned to civilization in 1859 and spent hours and hours writing fiction. He wrote fast, and his stories were read like crazy. But the man had never had enough money. His poverty made him always anxious about money. After a few years in St. Petersburg, he fled to Europe, not escaping the government, but his creditors knocking on his door every day. In Germany, he spent hours in casinos trying to get some quick money, but nothing worked. He moved from country to country like a nomad, and even wrote his novel The Idiot in 1868 while in Switzerland, only a year before Professor Nietzsche took the job in Basel. It is possible the two men might have been in the same city at some point, but Nietzsche, being a young man, might not have noticed this old, brooding Russian dude loitering outside casinos. Dostoevsky married a few times and had a few kids. From 1860 until his death in 1881, he published his great novels, including Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and the Brothers Karamazov. He died in 1881, aged 59. Nietzsche taught in Basel for 10 years, from 1869 to 79, before his health forced him to retire, so he spent the next 10 years traveling and writing. In 1889, Nietzsche went mad, which left him incapacitated for the next 11 years until his death in 1900. He was 55 years old. He never married and had no kids. Now, before I look at their works and philosophies, let me clarify one thing. Dostoevsky was a novelist, therefore he didn't articulate his ideas overtly like Nietzsche did. Instead, Dostoevsky used his characters to articulate his ideas through storytelling devices. So his characters are like a thin wall between us and Dostoevsky's philosophical views. So I'll mainly focus on his protagonist as a way to gauge Dostoevsky's own ideas. Dostoevsky's first novel, Poor Folk, published when he was 24 years old, looked at the class inequality in Russia. His first major work after his return from Siberia was Notes from Underground, published in 1864 when he was 43 years old, in which he questioned modern rationality, outlining the irrational side of human life. 2 years later, he published his most famous novel, Crime and Punishment, in which he depicted a godless world in which his protagonist, Raskolnikov, influenced by Western ideas such as socialism, rationalism, utilitarianism, justifies murdering a woman for her money so he can improve his own life and become a great man who could change the world like Napoleon did. In 1869, he published The Idiot, in which he shows how a Jesus-like figure couldn't survive in modern-day Russia. In 1872, he published Demons, in which he showed how radical ideas justify violence and causes chaos in a fictional town in Russia, in a way predicting the Russian Revolution some 50 years before it happened. In 1880, he published his last novel, often considered his magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov, in which he pits 4 brothers against one another, each representing a different philosophy of life. One atheist, one hedonist, one religious, and one with deep resentment. In all his novels, Dostoevsky showed the destructive side of modern rationality, especially atheism in Russia, and how radical ideas were destroying the social and religious fabric of Russian society. Nietzsche's first major work was The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, in which Nietzsche reinterpreted ancient Greek civilization, not through the status quo of rationality, but through the Greek tragedies before Socrates. Nietzsche thought Western philosophy took the wrong step when it followed rational philosophers like Socrates. As a result, West solely championed reason at the expense of passion and emotions. This became Nietzsche's foundation for his critique of modernity and its rational engine. In 1878, he published Human All Too Human, a collection of aphorisms on a variety of topics, which allowed him to develop a more coherent set of ideas and be more focused in his future books. In 1882, he published Gay Science, in which he first articulated the death of God and his doctrine of eternal recurrence, which means everything in the universe is eternally cyclical, very similar to the Eastern philosophy of cyclical time in Buddhism and Hinduism. In 1883, he published his most popular book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a philosophical novel in which he forces the Persian prophet to reject religion and become a messenger for Übermensch. I have dedicated a whole video on this, in which I summarize the book and discuss its three central themes: eternal recurrence, will to power, and Übermensch in great detail. In 1886, he published Beyond Good and Evil, in which he questions morality as a stifling force, arguing that good and evil are not opposites as everyone thinks, but simply the manifestations of the same universal or natural will in humans, which Schopenhauer had put forward a few decades earlier. In 1887, he published On the Genealogy of Morality, in which he takes a more naturalistic or Darwinian approach to understanding morality, good and evil, guilt and conscience, while concluding that all of them are anti-life and anti-nature. His last book was Exe Homo, published after his death, in which he looks at his own life and work as someone who exposed the problems and deficiencies of Western philosophy. It's like a self-portrait of a philosopher. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche lived during a time when European philosophers and thinkers like Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx, Stuart Mill, and others were responding to the Enlightenment philosophers of the previous century, like Voltaire, Kant, Rousseau, Hume, etc., who emphasized rational humans at the expense of God and religion. But advancement in science, and especially Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, shook the religious foundations, so 19th century Europe witnessed the development and growth of atheism, which replaced God with rational humans. In the absence of God as a source of social and moral values of what is right and what's wrong, many people searched for new values in life. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche grappled with this fundamental question. If God didn't exist, then what was the purpose of human life? And how do we organize society if there's no God as a moral arbiter telling us what is right and what's wrong? The European Enlightenment offered rationality as an answer to the absence of God and religion. In other words, what was rational was good and what was irrational was bad. Europeans saw how science allowed technology to flourish to solve so many fundamental human problems. Science allowed humans to understand the world, the human body, and provide concrete solutions. God, on the other hand, never offered real solutions, only promises of afterlife. So it became common sense to believe that rationality could solve all human problems, including morality. It could feed you, clothe you, cure your illnesses, and every human problem was only a stone's throw away from a new invention or discovery. There was nothing better than reason to replace God. As Europe prospered and colonized more territories, instead of people becoming happy and blissful, they turned savages against one another. Despite the Enlightenment rationality being widespread, European nations fought terrible wars, leaving millions dead and millions hungry, ill, and in pain. And to make matters even worse, those well off at the top of social hierarchy still had existential problems. So in the absence of meaning and purpose, they indulged themselves in hedonistic, instantly gratifying activities like eating too much, shopping, or even gambling. There was something irrational about human behavior. Whether at the top of the food chain or at the bottom, people acted irrationally from time to time. They all had irrational tendencies despite years and centuries of rationality. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche realized that rationality didn't offer a great solution to the problem of meaning. Rationality made everyone nihilistic. Those in power tore through society and the world for their own selfish purposes, and those without power waited their turn for a good moment to revolt and take revenge. The guillotines of the French Revolution showed that the poor and the disadvantaged revolutionaries were as ruthless, bloodthirsty, and vengeful as those they had toppled. Rationality, instead of bringing peace, prosperity, and happiness, became a robust tool for the people to exploit others for their own selfish end. It was just a tool, not a purpose. Whoever had access to the products of reason, i.e. science and technology, they used it to control others or inflict pain on others. This was no better than religions, gods, demons, all the things deemed irrational or dogmatic. Dostoevsky articulated the problem of rationality first in Notes from Underground in 1864, but later in his 1866 novel Crime and Punishment, whose protagonist Raskolnikov justifies his crime of murdering 2 women on the ground that he belongs to the group of extraordinary people. Therefore, he is above law and morality in the absence of God. Since there is no God, some exceptional humans, which Raskolnikov thinks he is one, can create their own moral values. In other words, anything is permissible as long as his aim is good. He wants to alleviate his poverty and later change the world for the better. In other words, he's a Napoleon in the making, so his good end justifies the means. To show how irrational humans are, in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky's protagonist refuses treatment for his liver illness and instead hides himself inside a basement, yet full of resentment and hatred, highlighting that humans are more motivated by irrational phenomena than reason. Rationality is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how the human animal works. Our deeper motivations are quite irrational. So the exactitude of rationality, instead of liberating us, it stifles us even more, where we cannot express ourselves freely. It turns us into a machine-like agents that only believe in 2 + 2 = 4 and nothing else, which makes us inherently self-centered, with the narrow understanding of the world, and this leaves us unhappy. Dostoevsky says humans are far more complicated than that. We seek meaning, purpose that goes beyond our material needs. 2 + 2 = 4 only offers solution to our material needs and physical pain. But we need a purpose that is bigger than ourselves and a cure for our existential suffering. Dostoevsky's rational atheist Ivan Karamazov goes mad at the end. Raskolnikov ends up in Siberia to serve his punishment. In The Idiot, his atheist character fails in his suicide attempt, a pathetic loser in every sense. In Demons, his protagonist commits suicide once his dirty secrets are out. Nietzsche also understood that with the death of God, rationality was the dominant lens through which people not only saw but also organized the world. Everything was rationally explained, either through rational science or philosophy. Then Nietzsche read Schopenhauer, who was influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism. Schopenhauer saw something deeper than rationality that motivates humans, something bigger than reason. He called it will. Schopenhauer's will is a fundamental force in the universe, and more importantly in the living beings that motivate them to continue living. We have no control over this will. It's beyond ourselves. It's a universal will. It's like gravity, invisible to us, yet it keeps us grounded on earth. It basically is blind will that keeps us alive. These Eastern lens give Nietzsche to look critically at the entire Western civilization and philosophy, all the way to Socrates. He then realized that Western philosophy was extremely one-sided or left-brained, rational, analytical, in other words, focused too much on 2 + 2 = 4. As a result, European modernity ignored the other side of human existence, the emotional, the passionate, the artistic right brain. He noticed that the pre-Socrates ancient Greeks championed both reason and passion in their tragedies. Apollo, the god of reason and science, and Dionysius, the god of passion and art, balance each other. But with Socrates' method of questioning things, and later Aristotle's scientific approach, and much later the European modernity shifted more towards reason-based Apolline world, while labeling human passion as something irrational, therefore must be contained, stifled, and even eradicated. In other words, humans were becoming all too human, too tame, too timid, and less natural and less spontaneous. So both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche diagnosed modernity as being too rational, which resulted in nihilistic self-indulgent materialism, an insatiable desire for instant gratification of the self. Now I'll look at their solutions to the problem of nihilism and reason-based modernity. Dostoevsky's solution to the problem of nihilism was to return to the past. He offers religion as an antidote to modern problem of meaninglessness. His Orthodox upbringing had a profound impact on him, but also his mother's reading of the Bible to him as a child remained with him throughout his life. On the outside, he saw how poor Russians found solace in the Orthodox religion despite their economic miseries and existential suffering. Orthodox Christianity is based on the idea of community being more important than the individual. In other words, Dostoevsky says you can find meaning if you truly serve other people, love other people, Love others despite their flaws. Love them despite their past mistakes. Dostoevsky's religious solution did not make him very popular in Russia at the time. He became even less popular when the Bolsheviks took over in 1917. His popularity has started to grow now as more and more people find themselves disillusioned with modernity. Nietzsche, however, took a very different path. Instead of going back to the past and religion, or taking a soft feminine approach of coddling people with religious cushions, Nietzsche went far back to human evolution. He returned to nature. Yes, Nietzsche placed his solution to nihilism in nature. For him, nature is raw, honest, and full of passion. So he went back to the pre-religion world where humans were one with nature and acted naturally. Why? Because there was no robust morality to stifle them. There was no religious punishment to deter people to push their artistic boundaries. Nietzsche's biggest problem with religion was that it protected the weak. As a result, it shackled the geniuses too from being creative. In other words, religion is not about greatness or creativity or pushing boundaries, rather it's about providing solace to the weak-minded individuals. For Nietzsche, religion was coddling people, not pushing them to confront their fears. Instead, it was shielding them from danger, risk, spiders, demons, while providing a safe space. Today, people say the young are overprotected, so we have a generation of very sensitive types, the so-called snowflakes, who cannot cope with the slightest criticism or hardship. Nietzsche says religions have coddled humanity for centuries and millennia. Then, in recent centuries, rationality has done the same thing, providing us with too much comfort. Our technology has made us too soft and too sensitive that it's hard to imagine ourselves surviving in the wild or striving for greatness. It is time we break from this religious spell and rationality-driven, comfort-seeking mentality and dive into the untamed nature where we have the freedom to grow whichever way we see potential. In some way, you could say that Nietzsche is reacting to Dostoevsky, saying that religion is not the answer, but the problem. Nietzsche sees Dostoevsky's religious solution as being too feminine, seeking a godlike male authority figure who keeps all the dangers away from us so we can flourish in the safety. So Dostoevsky's solution is not only feminine, who needs a masculine god, it's also for children seeking a father. Nietzsche's solution is for individuals to become masculine and father themselves by confronting their fears and conquering new artistic and philosophical territories. Now here the two fundamentally differ. Dostoevsky promotes goodness. He asks you to love people no matter how bad or good they are, no matter what kind of mistakes they've made in the past. It's through love, not reason, that we can find meaning in life. It's through faith that we can find clarity in life. Being a cynic by questioning things is not the answer, but naivety, innocence, and simplicity are the answers. You can only find those if you believe in a higher being. Nietzsche, however, doesn't believe in goodness. He says you should not aim to be good, moral, or a nice person. Instead, we should aim for greatness. This greatness may come at a cost, but that is fine because the purpose of life, and human life in particular, is not to be good or soft or morally correct, but to flourish, grow, and dominate. For example, if a YouTuber, Nietzsche says you should not aim to be good to everyone or always promote morally good stuff. Instead, your aim should be to grow and become the best version of yourself and the best in your field. Okay, that's not the best example, but you get the point. Nietzsche was fascinated with art, music in particular. In his philosophical novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he proposed Übermensch, genius artists and great philosophers who could provide humanity with new values. I discuss this in relation to novelists such as Franz Kafka, Marcel Proust, and Charles Bukowski, who dedicated their lives to the production of great art. For Nietzsche, artists and geniuses and philosophers, which I'm sure he included himself, should have complete freedom to create and write. No morality police or religious doctrines should stifle their natural creative geniuses. Art is not about justice or goodness, but greatness. Because nature is not just, fair or equal. Human species and life in general have survived and thrived not because they have been just or morally good. Because nature experimented in millions of different ways. Those strong enough survived and those weak died away. Since we are nature, we should also experiment, more specifically in the arena of art and culture. Nietzsche divides humans into two groups, the slave majority and the genius minority. The slaves do not have original ideas, they simply follow the crowd or herd, or even mobs. But then there are individual geniuses who are capable of original ideas. These select few have the ability to transcend human life to become Übermensch, and then able to create values for the rest of society. Human histories are full of these great people, mainly men, according to Nietzsche, who have invented, created, discovered things that benefited humanity as a whole. These great geniuses could be philosophers, composers, scientists, artists, or even novelists. So based on this, one could say Dostoevsky was a Nietzschean Übermensch whose art of fiction and storytelling helped humans flourishing in some sense. Dostoevsky realized that the human psyche surely wasn't rational all the time, and most of the time it was incredibly flimsy and weak. In his novel Demons, he depicted the consequence of a rational utopia, which was nothing but deception and madness. Dostoevsky's experience of almost getting executed allowed him to see life with clarity. He valued life greatly, so this motivated him to do something bigger than himself. He dedicated his entire life to writing to understand the human psyche. In other words, he found his own life's purpose in his work and his writing. He struggled throughout his life with poverty, legal system, family, addictions, epilepsy, and above all, years of sitting alone to write. And in that struggle, he found his purpose. He found his purpose in his works. So he personifies a Nietzschean Übermensch who suffered a great deal in the service of creating art. Dostoevsky diagnosed the problem of nihilism and produced amazing art. He says that those with big brains suffer more. In other words, he served humanity by writing. So he was a Nietzschean Übermensch artist who transcended humanity to reach the recesses of human subconscious, to understand the animalistic, passionate side of human motivation. He was an artist of human irrationality. Dostoevsky offered religious faith, naivety, and love. For him, we cannot love a human being forever. We might love them for a month, a decade, or even a generation, but not for eternity. For that, we need non-human God who can unite us all despite our cultural differences. Without God, it's very difficult to motivate people to do good things, according to Dostoevsky. Without God, we become fat, self-indulgent, addicted to drugs and alcohol. In other words, we need someone in the family who tells us and reminds us to be good, to love others. Why? Because as human animals, we are erratic, irrational, selfish, and forgetful. Dostoevsky says to be good, you must curb your selfish desires. Nietzsche says, harness your will to power to become an Übermensch or transcend humanity for artistic flourishing. Dostoevsky says take responsibility for your own actions, while Nietzsche says forget moral responsibility. Instead, use your freedom to push boundaries in pursuit of things greater than yourself. I should point out that Nietzsche didn't clearly justify violence. His main focus was artistic endeavor, not political goal. Dostoevsky says find solace by being among a loving community. Nietzsche says find a cave for some solitude to find something bigger inside you. Dostoevsky sends his protagonists to Siberia, underground, or even in a Swiss sanatorium so they can find the goodness, the love inside their own heart. While Nietzsche sends his Zarathustra to the cave to gain wisdom from nature and solitude so he can ready himself for the battle and struggle for greatness. It's obvious that Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were talking to a different set of audience. Dostoevsky wrote for the Russian people, mainly westernized intellectuals. But his real audience was the majority of people who found themselves lost in this world, fallen from the economic race, stuck in the mud, so to speak. His religious solution appealed to those at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder, where being good was a real solution. Dostoevsky says, make life simpler, don't chase your lofty dreams as Raskolnikov did in Crime and Punishment, and for God's sake, don't kill or commit violence for a better life, as in Demons. Nietzsche, however, wrote for the philosophers and elite artists who are not seeking goodness but greatness through creativity. His audience is not the masses, instead people at the top or those with creative geniuses who are seeking a purpose greater than themselves. People who want to sacrifice their lives for the flourishing of humanity, not from a moral or religious point of view, but from an evolutionary and naturalistic point of view. Artists are often antisocial and deeply flawed human beings if you judge them through morality, but people love their art. For example, both Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin had deep flaws and weren't very nice people, but produced great art. Another example is Picasso had some deep flaw, but he still managed to make great art. For Nietzsche, artists can genuinely tap into a deeper place in human psyche, deeper well in human evolution to make art that move people. He was more fascinated with musicians, because music as an art form is not only universal, but it's also very deep. Nietzsche might consider Raskolnikov a slave-minded person who is more motivated by revenge than greatness. His subsequent guilt through delirium and eventual confessions show his slave mentality and delusional mind. Incidentally, both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche agreed that society's legal system wasn't based on justice, but retribution and revenge. Nietzsche's biggest problem with religion is that it tames you from achieving your true creative potential. Dostoevsky is content with that. As long as society is peaceful, people content and loving one another, it's better than modern obsession with an insatiable desire for more and more. Dostoevsky says blind faith and love, while Nietzsche says blind artistic creativity that keeps probing new horizons. Both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are against shortcuts. You have to earn your spoils in life, not steal it. I cannot ignore their distinct facial hair. From an evolutionary perspective, facial hair, mustache, and beard are for sexual selection, just like peacock's tail. Even women with terrible eyesight could recognize a man with a mustache or beard to mate with. Joking aside, it has also been suggested that men with more robust facial hair kept dominance among other men, so they could mate with more women. But today we live in a very safe society, so most men shave to show how nice we are. Historically speaking, actually my own observation, I could be wrong, mustache showed hard power and strength, while beard showed soft power like wisdom and generosity. Santa's beard reaches his belly, while Hitler and Stalin oiled their mustache hard. Philosophers and artists and writers groomed their long beards, while those with political and economic ambitions oiled their mustache. Both the mustachioed Nietzsche and bearded Dostoevsky are goats, pun intended. Dostoevsky's animal is not a goat, but more like a friendly dog, as he promotes a motherly instinct of nurturing and caring for others, while Nietzsche is promoting a fearless fatherly instinct of fighting dragons in the wild. So his animal is a tiger or a lion, not only because of their whiskers, but also because of their ferocious will to power and carving their own path in life. Who should you read? I say read both. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche together is a better package in guiding you towards a fulfilling life. I think we need goodness and greatness. In other words, we need a lot of good people and some great people who push things forward, invent, discover things. Artists who capture people's imagination, and great storytellers who articulate the voice of their generations, just like Dostoevsky did. Nietzsche tells you to get up on your feet, stop blaming others, and do something creative in whatever field you're in. Don't avoid suffering, because to be great you have to suffer. Life is meant to be suffering. Write a great novel, produce great art, invent something new. Have blind courage to confront your own fears and have the dedication to persist in your path and forget your own selfish desires. For Nietzsche, life's purpose is not to be mediocre, but great. Dostoevsky says individualism of me before everyone else will make you very unhappy. The purpose of life is to be good to others and love everyone despite their flaws and mistakes. So to sum up, Dostoevsky warns you about the danger of new ideas, and Nietzsche tells you to carve your own path, away from the crowd. Nietzsche presses you to not only understand your societal norms, traditions, and values, but deeply embody them before you break with them to carve your own path. You cannot topple the statue of those who came before you fully digesting their ideas. Nietzsche tells you directly, like a masculine father would, make something of your life. Dostoevsky shows you by telling you stories like a mother would, so to avoid the same mistakes, dangers other people made, and to cultivate your love for everyone. To flourish, a child needs both parents, a German father and a Russian mother. Incidentally, there is a Russian fictional character named Andrei in Ivan Goncharov's masterpiece Oblomov, who is a very well-rounded character. In complete contrast to the main character Oblomov, the laziest character in literature. Why? He has a German father who instills discipline in him and a Russian mother who loves him dearly. You too, you need both the amazing psychological tales of Dostoevsky and the robust and probing philosophical aphorisms of Nietzsche. So the biggest antidote to laziness is Dostoevsky plus Nietzsche. They will help you make something of your life. In my comparison of Dostoevsky to Tolstoy, I put Tolstoy in the mother's seat while Dostoevsky in the father's seat. Between the two great Russians, Dostoevsky takes a more psychological and individualistic approach of tough love, while Tolstoy takes a more communitarian, egalitarian, universalist approach. Nietzsche, on the other hand, is the lone wolf or lone tiger who has little time for motherly love. He says, don't cry, don't be a victim, toughen up, while Dostoevsky wanted to shield Russians from bad ideas coming from Europe. Dostoevsky, for the most part, was a critic of modernity. He argued that the Enlightenment-induced modernity with a human-centered morality had not given us a convincing alternative to God and religion. Science had no answers when it came to life's meaning or happiness. Religion, despite being an old and rustic tool, still remained the trusted tool in the shed. A tool that has served humanity for thousands of years. Despite being very blunt compared to science and understanding nature, it still gave millions of Russians a sense of psychological comfort that science couldn't. This was, of course, 200 years ago in Russia, where life for the majority was a matter of survival. For sure, science had made life easier through medicine and technology, according to Dostoevsky, but it had failed to offer an adequate tool for life's meaning. In most of his novels, religion comes head-to-head with Western modernity, and Dostoevsky sees religion as the older tool that has stood the test of time, which can give modern man a more fulfilling and meaningful life. Today, the pace of technological development is so rapid that a lot of men feel alienated from their fathers, and a lot of young men don't have a father figure in their lives. As a result, a lot of people, especially men, feel lost and lonely. So Dostoevsky's novels are mostly about lonely men struggling in the modern life. Fyodor Dostoevsky is more like a father Dostoevsky to a lot of lonely young men. Reading him can shed light to a lot of modern emptiness people feel. His ultimate message was to be honest and free from social deception, but most importantly from self-deception. I would love to hear from you. Have you read any of his books, and what do you think of them? And what are your favorite novels by Dostoevsky? Thank you for watching. Spasiba большое.